I've been experiencing some weird things in my house for years now. I think it started back in 2011. Let me explain. I came back from school with my siblings and my mother. I was 12, I think. We arrived at home, and I took off my shoes and ran upstairs. I peeked inside my sister's room as I was walking towards my room, and that's when I realized something was wrong. It was all messy, and everything was out of their place. I told my mom as I feared somebody had broken in, but we checked all the doors and the windows, and they were locked. Now you can imagine my surprise when I saw that my room was also messy. My clothes and my mattress were on the floor, and everything just seemed wrong, as if somebody had done it out of hate. We all got the creeps when we saw my sister's stuffed animals. They were scratched, torn apart, like if some sort of animal had gotten inside my house. But as I said, every possible entrance was locked. We never knew what happened that day. Things were normal for years after that occurrence, but then in 2014, I think, some really creepy stuff started to happen. One day I was alone in my house. It was a school day, but I had faked a stomachache, so I stayed home. I have a TV in my room, so I just left my room to get some food or go to the bathroom. I was minding my own business watching something on Netflix, when suddenly I saw a human-shaped figure walking past my room. It was tall and thin, and it took the shadow a few seconds to escape my eyesight, but it felt like an eternity. It went into my sister's room, and I think it was walking out of my mom's room. Now, as you can imagine, I was freaked out. I locked my door and tried to get my mind off of it, and told no one about this at first. This is where the story gets even more scarier. My room is very big, because I share it with my brother. And one night, my sister came to our room and asked if she could sleep in the small couch we have in our room. I didn't answer, as it was really late and I just wanted to go back to sleep. But my brother did, as they are very close. We all went to sleep, and the next day, she told us she was scared but didn't tell us why. That of course made me nervous, because my sister is really mature, and it was very rare to see her scared. We went on with our day, and when the night came, me and my brother heard my sister arguing with my mom. We went in and started to hear the conversation. My sister was crying and seemed very scared and mad. I remember she said that my mom was trying to creep her out, and she ran to her room. We asked my mom what was wrong with my sister, and she told us why my sister was so scared. She said as she was falling asleep, she felt as if somebody was sitting on her bed, and then she saw a shadow standing close to her bed. Obviously, I was creeped out. My mom had also told us she had seen this shadow walking by, but that she wasn't scared of it. My brother told me that one night he was trying to fall asleep after being on the phone for hours. I was already asleep by then, but he recalls hearing a faint whistling sound that immediately caught his attention. The whistling was coming from my bed. He said it was very clear and loud, and that's what freaked him out. So imagine that something was next to me whistling while I was asleep. I forget to mention that my doorbell would ring every day at 3. It all started when one day we were all eating in my kitchen and somebody rang our doorbell. One of us got to the door just to realize nobody was there. We didn't really care because we thought it was a kid pulling a prank on us. But the next day it rang again, and nobody was there. And that of course kept happening. Sometimes it was at 3 o'clock exactly, sometimes it was at 3:01 or 3:02. One day, my mom was outside my house, and at 3 o'clock, she was back from the store or something. When she was about to walk towards the door, she swears she saw as if somebody was pressing the doorbell button. And we disconnected our doorbell after that. Finally, one day I was alone in my room. I was using my iPod while it was charging. I was minding my own business when suddenly my iPod decided to throw itself to the ground. It felt as if somebody had pushed it very hard and out of my hand. The push was so hard that it disconnected the charger and dropped my iPod so hard that the screen shattered completely. Whatever is living in my house really hates us. Those were some of the strange things that have happened in my house. Not all of them.
This just happened about 2 hours ago, and I'm still shaking. I live on the coast of SC, and my backyard is directly on the marshland. So I woke up and went downstairs to use the bathroom. I kept having this weird nagging feeling like I was forgetting something or that something was off, so I went to find my mother. She's a night owl and she stays up super late doing gardening and stuff like that. She even likes to feed the raccoons. So I went to my backyard, and I then see her standing there about 100 feet from the back door facing the marshland. I called out for her, but she didn't hear me, so I just started walking out towards her. Once I started getting closer, she turned to face me with a completely blank expression. I asked her what was wrong. I was about 12 feet away from her, and she turned back towards the marshland again. Then, the back door swings open, and I turn to see my mother standing on the deck, and she's calling out to ask me what I'm doing. I've never ran so fast in my life, but as I looked back to the marsh, I could just see that thing disappearing, whatever it was. It looked just like my mum did. I yelled at my mum to go inside and that there was something out there. I told her exactly what I'd seen, and I started shaking and crying. We woke up my husband and dad, and they think I must have just been in a sleep state or that I dreamed it, but I can't stop shaking. The craziest thing is that I could see footprints from where she was standing. I know I didn't just see this in my head. I know I'm not losing my mind.
Hello everybody. I wanted to share details of regular unexplained and paranormal activity that has been occurring at our family home for nearly 30 years. The activity ranges from cold spots and noises to moving shadows and full-on apparitions. In turn, each family member has heard or witnessed something, but some more than others. I'm interested to read what people's thoughts are on the matter, and if anybody else has experienced such things, you should write them down. I grew up in Salford, near Manchester in the UK, and we moved into what is a 2-up, 2-down council house in and around 1990 or 1991. During that period of time, it was myself, my parents, and my younger brother. I'm not sure when the activity first started precisely, but I'm aware that it is within a couple years of us moving in. My brother from an early age complained of being disturbed at night by an old man, and on several occasions would wake up and inform my grandmother, who would babysit of an evening whilst my parents were out. He would say that the man had told him to wake up for school. As far as I knew, this was chalked up to bad dreams, or a vivid imagination. However, the instances of my brother seeing this old man became more frequent and started to occur during the daytime. My mom recalls a particular day when my brother dashed downstairs, visibly upset, telling her that the man was following him and was walking down the stairs. She checked the staircase, but nobody was there. It was around this time that she had her initial encounter with the old man. When vacuuming the living room, she describes seeing a pair of legs in pressed, pinstripe trousers and a knitted tank top on the torso. She says that from the bottom, the apparition was almost like a living person which stood in the room, but then it started to fade towards the top of the body, with the head of course and the face barely visible. She remembers throwing the vacuum in the direction of the figure and running through to the back of the house and outside. A few days later, she told her neighbor about what she had seen. The neighbor, of course, as you might imagine, was a little bit disturbed and told her that who she was describing was the previous occupier, an elderly man by the name Fred. He had passed away in the house, and it was a couple of years after his wife. Fred was seen on several occasions shortly after, again by my mom and brother, but also my grandmother. My grandmother told me years later of her experience, that she was helping my mom do some work in our garden when she saw an elderly man walk out of our back door and across the garden, vanishing as he walked. She told my mom of what she had seen, who in turn told her about the elderly man who seemed to be haunting the house. Although he didn't seem threatening, it really unsettled my grandmother, and coupled with my brother's encounters, she refused to take care of us at the house, and instead we spent a lot of time at hers. To this day, she isn't particularly fond of visiting my parents' home. From then on out, sounds of walking around in the bedrooms or on the stairs upstairs when nobody was in or out of them ended up increasing, and items disappearing or being moved around became a part of the norm, particularly for my mom. We did notice that the activity was more persistent around summertime. My mom was, and still is, the person who witnessed the most activity out of all of us. Whether this was because she was in the house more or she is particularly sensitive, I'm not sure. But I believe a lot of the activity can be explained logically. What is interesting, however, is that when our parents decided to move my brother and I into different rooms, my brother seemingly stopped being disturbed by Fred, but my mom experienced more. I personally didn't experience anything until I was 14 or 15 years old, when in the early hours of the morning, I heard continuous, almost deliberate footsteps around the stairs and landing area. I remember waking up, quite annoyed of course, believing it to be my dad having a relentless night. And of course, as you'd imagine, all I wanted was enough sleep for school the next day. I called out to him to shut up and go to bed. That's when the noise suddenly stopped. No noise of feet returning to the bedroom or going downstairs. Just complete silence. Around a minute or two later, my bedroom door flung open and hit the wall. I remember jolting up and seeing nothing in the doorway, but the sound of footsteps started moving around my room. I yelled out to my parents and dived under the covers. My dad rushed down the landing and the footsteps stopped just as he came into the room. I told him what had happened and that I was frightened. He didn't laugh it off or tell me it was nothing to worry about, but instead told me to get into the bed with my mom and that he would stay in my room for the rest of the night. I found out a few years later that this was a regular occurrence for my parents, constantly being woken up by footsteps on the landing and stairs as well as around the perimeter of their bed. My parents seemed unnerved that something had started to disturb another one of their children. I'm aware that this post is becoming very lengthy, but there's so much more to tell you guys, especially as we now have a younger sister who is having her own unusual experiences. I live in my own home with my little family, and it seems to be spirit-free. But even to this day, I find I'm having conversations with my parents about the unusual activity happening in their home. The most concerning so far has been of a dark figure sitting cross-legged in the corner of my brother's room around 4 or 5 years ago. He says that he felt like it watched him for an extended length of time, and that when he tried to ignore it, he could feel and hear tapping on the headboard of his bed. Eventually, it ended up being too much for him, and he vaulted out of bed, past the figure that was sitting in the corner, and out of the room and vomited in the bathroom with fright. However, as a true show of masculinity and the obvious need to get some sleep for an early start, he went back to bed, enduring the tappings again and told whatever to go to hell, because he had work in the morning. For the past few years, my 11-year-old sister has experienced a lot of knocking noise around her headboard, similar to the ones my brother experienced the night he saw the dark figure. It's important to point out that these are occurring in different rooms and on different types of headboards. My brother's are leather and wood. My sister's are iron frame. Since a youngster, she has preferred to stay in my parents' room, but from the age of 7 or 8 years old, they knew they needed to get her out of the habit. Nowadays, my sister has it initially okay with going to bed in her room, but she gets disturbed around the same time every other night by knocking sounds on her bed and finds her way back to my parents' bedroom. As far as I'm aware, she hasn't seen anything unusual, but she definitely isn't keen on being alone in her room for long periods of time and has complained to me in the private that she thinks somebody watches her. My parents are reluctant to talk to her about what might be happening and the family's past experiences as my sister gets easily spooked. They have asked myself and my brother not to elaborate on what she may be experiencing. My belief is that it could be attributed to the telekinesis theory of young children, especially those nearing or going through puberty, which can make things happen around them without realizing. But my mom is on the firm understanding that my sister may be encountering a spirit. My mom has recalled the following story a couple of times to me. I'm not sure I believe it to what she thinks it is, but I find it fascinating nonetheless. On the night my grandfather was dying, a little over 10 years ago, my dad had been told to come to the hospital with his siblings. My mom was heavily pregnant at the time and chose to stay at home and await the news. She remembers sitting in the living room watching TV when she could hear knocking on the front window and on the front door. It is a knock that members of our family do when visiting our house. My mom assumed a relative had come over regarding my granddad and looked out of the window to see who it was. The only thing is, nobody was there. She thought it unusual, but brushed it off and went into the kitchen to make a cup of tea. Again, the noise of tapping on the window and the front door happened again. But as she was about to see what it was, the noise of running came from across the landing and down the stairs, stopping at the front door. Thinking it was my brother and something was wrong, she went to go investigate. Nothing, though. She said she had the most uneasiest feeling at this point, and something just felt very off. Shortly after, my mom received a call from my dad, informing her that my grandfather had passed away. That's when she realized the knocking had happened, around the same time he passed away. To this day, my mom believes that my grandfather may have been trying to visit his son, and Fred wasn't happy about another spirit entering the home, I think it's possible that with my grandfather's death imminent, tension and emotion would have been high, and that could be a psychological thing on my mom's part. That said, I don't think she has made it up. It genuinely unnerves her even now, but it may have been her mind playing tricks rather than paranormal. However, this is one of my favorite stories of unusual activity at our home, and it does make others feel uneasy when I tell them.
I first heard this story when I was in college. I'd come home from winter break, and I remember it was just me and my dad in the house. I was watching some kind of ghost hunters program on TV, just for the laughs. I really don't believe any of that. Now when you watch your programs on TV like that, it's so obvious that they're fake. It's too hard for me to let them go into my head and believe them. I mean really, I just can't get into it. Now my dad was the same way, so I thought. He seemed interested in the paranormal, but only very slightly. He was the kind of guy who would often scoff at anything supernatural. The program I was watching flipped to a commercial, and I casually got up and found my dad in the kitchen. Out of the blue, I asked him, "Hey Dad, do you believe in ghosts?" "Yup." His reply actually shocked me. "Really?" I was a bit taken back. "Like, it just doesn't seem like you," I said to him. He shrugged his shoulders and mulled over at what I just said. "Yeah," he replied, eventually. "But I know ghosts are real. I met one." Upon hearing this statement, I had to know the full story. You see, my dad is like me. He likes to tell the stories. I could retell most of the stories from memory that he's told me, but just because he would tell me them so frequently, to anybody who would listen, here's my dad's story that I'd never actually heard, and it's an event that actually changed my dad's life. To this day, I don't know if I believe it or not, but when somebody is so influential in your life and tries telling you this, and they're so down to earth, you kind of have to believe it. Now though he never brings it up when I talk to him about it, I swear it's completely true. There is no exaggeration, and I have no doubt in my mind about what happened. So here is the story in my dad's words. It was back in the house in Tacoma, where you grew up until you were about 4. My parents still lived in the house, but I was going to college. I was back visiting them for the weekend. I was just over at the Tacoma Community College, so it wasn't that far away. I came back often to visit and get a home-cooked meal. I remembered that I was sitting down for dinner with my parents, just 3 of us. It was in late spring, early summer season, so it hadn't really gotten dark out yet. We were talking like normal, when the phone suddenly rang. It was in the kitchen. My mom got up and answered the phone, leaving my dad and me in the room together alone. After a short while, she called my dad into the kitchen as well. "Leo, can you come here for a moment?" I remembered she seemed worried, like her voice was shaken. My dad wiped his face, got up and joined my mum in the kitchen. They weren't in there for long, but they were quietly talking, and it felt strange. After a few moments they come out of the kitchen. They had their coats on now. "Something's up and we have to go out for a bit," my mum said. "There's dessert in the fridge, you just help yourself. Don't worry about the dishes. We'll do them when we get back." So my dad said nothing, but I could tell from the look on his face that it was serious. My mum looked genuinely worried. They were out of the door in a flash, and I left to finish my dinner at the table. I cleared the table and washed my plate, despite my mother's instructions. Then I went to the main room to read. I sat down on the sofa, opened one of my school books and began to relax. Hours went by, and my parents still hadn't come back yet, and it was around 11 o'clock. My parents still hadn't come back, so I went to get ready for bed. I walked up the stairs, making my way to the bathroom. I suddenly heard the strangest sound. I paused and listened for a while. It was the ceiling. The ceiling was making a slow, drawn-out whining noise. The wood was genuinely creaking. It wasn't an unusual sound. There was some unusual rhythm that made me feel uncomfortable and curious. After listening for a while, I pulled down the steps to the attic and listened a bit more. I could hear the sound more clearly now, along with a metallic creaking sound. I gathered up my courage and decided to investigate. Now I have to say, I wasn't scared. I did have an uneasy feeling. To be honest, after a few seconds though, I felt quite comfortable, even though it was very dark and eerie. The energy in the floor wasn't foreboding. It almost felt warm and inviting. As I looked around the attic, it soon became obvious where the sound was coming from. Among the boxes and various other storage items was an old rocking chair, one that belonged to my grandmother. It was one of the many possessions she had left with us at the house. She was in a nearby home for the elderly, and couldn't fit much of her belongings into the room. The rocking chair was gently rocking back and forth, causing the floorboard to creak beneath it. Next to the chair, there was also an old bird cage. The cage door was gently swinging open and closed, making a quiet metallic creak. I figured that it was just a draft, and knowing that the sounds would keep me up all night if I didn't put an end to it, I went out and wanted to find the source. I compared the corners of the room, but try as I might, I couldn't find the source of the draft, nor could I feel it myself. There were no windows and there wasn't much ventilation. It wasn't even windy outside. It was a calm evening. Furthermore, the chair was heavy as the birdcage was, yet there were other things nearby that weren't disturbed. There were stacks of paper and stuff like that. It really wasn't making much sense to me. After a while, I decided to give up and looked back at the chair. It was still gently rocking. I walked over to it and rested my arm on the armrest, and it suddenly stopped rocking. Still, I couldn't feel any kind of draft. I lifted my hand and the chair was calm and quiet, but as I turned away, I heard the creaking again. I turned back and the chair was still rocking. It was really strange, but as I said before, it wasn't really creeping me out much. I just shrugged it off and walked over to the birdcage. The door was still slowly swinging open and closed. The cage once housed a parrot that belonged to my grandmother, but it had been empty for a long time now. I figured that if I at least shut this, then I could stop one of the sounds. So I did that. I then started heading towards the steps. As I was about halfway down, I heard that same metallic creaking sound again. I looked behind me and the door was back open, swinging once again unlatched, right alongside the chair which continued rocking like before. Something had unlatched it. I sure hadn't done it myself. Now in any other circumstance I would have been scared out of my mind, but for whatever reason I wasn't. I just didn't feel easy. Now a rocking chair and a birdcage aren't really the most scary things anyway. I just ascended the attic with a last glance at the strange behaviour. I then went about my bedtime routine. The creaking sound continued for a while and I couldn't sleep for it. I went back downstairs to where I could hear the noise, and I continued reading. It was a little after midnight when my parents pulled into the driveway. They came in and found me reading and they sat down with me. My mum was crying. They explained to me that they had spent the night at the hospital where my grandmother had just passed away.
So a little bit of background story. I decided to ride my bike to and from work during the summer to save up a little more money to buy a nicer car. I was living in California's Central Valley, so it was hot during the day and warm at night, so not really a big deal. I rode my bike for roughly 3 months, 5 to 6 days a week, back and forth on the same path that led almost directly from my work and right to my house. One night we were getting out of work particularly late. I worked at a restaurant, and getting out at 1 in the morning on the weekends wasn't unheard of. My coworker who usually rode with me on days we worked together had gotten a ride from his girlfriend, so I was alone. Usually where I live, the summer nights are warm with a light breeze, and I actually love riding at night. There was no traffic, no families on bikes clogging both lanes, and all that kind of stuff. I pretty much always got back within 20 minutes of leaving, max 30 if I was really going slow. And this night was different though. From the get-go, as soon as I walked out the door, it was really cold, which is unheard of. So I decided to just ride fast and get home quick. It actually starts off pretty normal. I'm going over a bridge that goes over a freeway, and then it makes a weird turn. The street lamps behind me start to make a loud electrical noise, so I look back. It's as if something was approaching the lights behind me, and they start to flicker one by one. I'm a little spooked out at this point, but then I hear what sounds like another biker coming along the path behind me, and I feel relief that there's another person nearby me. Then the noise changes. It turns into a whistling, howling noise that rushes by me, actually flapping my shirt. Now, I'm on borderline freaking out at this point, so I ride even faster. I keep hearing sounds like whispering behind me, and multiple times it felt like something would snag the back of my shirt, or even the pants on my leg. Keep in mind, this bike path looks nearly identical from start to finish. It's just a path of dead grass on both sides and walls with houses. Very easy to lose track of where you are. So I keep riding and riding faster, and my heart is going faster than ever before. I'm on a fixed gear truck bike, so I can get it moving pretty quick when I want to. So I'm tearing down this path, and I never see a single sign of life the whole way down. No cars crossing at intersections, no people on back porches, just the path lights flickering behind me, and noises that sound almost human right behind me the whole time. I finally make it onto the road I turn on to get to my house. It's dead empty. There are 0 cars, and even in my semi-small town, this is unheard of. There's always cars stuck at a light or even at 7-Eleven on the corner, but there's no one anywhere. So I kept going, the light-sounding noises still behind me. I get right in front of my door and unlock it, and take my bike straight up through the door. I wasn't going to mess around and open the garage. I go up the stairs, and that's when the most terrifying part happened. I looked at the clock. It said it was 3:12 a.m. Now, it had taken me almost 2 hours to get home, and I still have no idea how it took me so long. I have no resolution for the noises, or even the flickering lights or the complete absence of people. But needless to say, I never took that bike path again.
I've been a police officer in Mineral Wells, Texas for about 5 years now. If you're wondering, Mineral Wells is about 50 miles west of Fort Worth and has a population of about 16,000. The people here are salt of earth type people, God-fearing, hard-working kind, but something has always been a little off about them, almost like they're carrying a secret that nobody's supposed to know. Mineral Wells become a ghost town after about 7 PM. That's at all of the drive-in stops, and it's really eerie, to be honest. It's very safe for my patrol car though. Now, in the 5 years that I've been there, I've never seen anything or heard anything strange. I don't believe any of the things I hear most of the time. If I hadn't had my own strange experience when I was a child, I'd probably be thinking I was crazy, but I'm not. The thing is that sometimes things happen that are truly unexplainable. They are real. I'd like to relay one of those experiences to you. Perhaps I can tell you. I have a ton. Now, to understand Mineral Wells, you have to know about its history. I learnt most of this when I visited the Historical Society after about 6 months of moving there. Apparently, it was founded in 1881 by a guy named J.A. Lynch. After Lynch dug up the first drinkable water, he claimed that there was something strange about the water though. Apparently, it was able to cure some of his wife's illnesses. It was almost like miracle water. Very soon after, word got out about this miracle water. Quickly, a second well was discovered, then a third. A woman decided to drink from the third well to try and cure her dementia. Guess what? She was miraculously cured. The local children started calling the third well the crazy water well, and they started just calling it the crazy water. It was strange how this miracle water flowed from the earth. News about this crazy water spread far and wide, and by the early 1900s, Miracle Wells had become the South's greatest health resort, with hundreds of mineral wells, bathhouses, bars, hotels, etc. People travelled all from over the country in hopes of experiencing this amazing healing power. As you probably imagine, many of the visitors were old or dying. Today, Mineral Wells is a shadow of its former self. Whilst it still has industry, it mostly operates as a tourism and retirement community, but don't let that fool you. In this town, there's a famous quote that says, "The past is never dead, it's not even the past." Now, after I'd been on the force for about a month, I had my first experience of strangeness of Mineral Wells. We got in a frantic 911 call about somebody finding a dead body. I still remember the address. It was at Baker Hotel. I was working nights there. Apparently, that's where the rookies start, and the call come in at about 12:30 AM. My partner and I were in the area, and it didn't take us long to get there. When we arrived, the 911 caller was gone, but the body was there, just as I had described it. It turned out to be a young woman. She was splayed out on the red brick steps that led up to the front entrance. Her back was broken and whatnot. It was honestly the first time that I'd ever seen anything like this. She had fallen from a great height. I remembered looking up to see if there were any balconies that she could have come from, but there weren't any. But there were plenty of windows since it was an old hotel. They didn't have very good safety features like modern hotels do. In fact, many of the windows were left open. I later learnt that the Baker Hotel had been shut down in the 70s, but no one would ever admit as to why. We secured the team and called out an investigation unit. The girl turned out to be a 29-year-old. She had been a resident of Mineral Wells her entire life and worked as a manager at a local cafe. On the night in question, Paulina had been out with some of her friends and was at a bar near the hotel. One of the girls that she had been out with had told the investigators that they had all been hanging out on the 7th floor of the hotel drinking after the bars closed. They suddenly realised that they couldn't find their friend anywhere. They began looking for her and found her clothes in a pile of one of the rooms next to an open window. When they realised that she had fallen, they called 911. There were only 2 bits of information they could offer. That the first was that she was called Paulina, and she had been overheard saying that she needed to go and meet Virginia. But none of them knew who her friend was. The second was that there were rumours in the town that she had been having an affair with the owner of the cafe she worked at, but none of them admitted ever seeing him with her. When I first heard all of this, it seriously disturbed me. By all accounts, she was a young, well-adjusted woman who had no reason to kill herself. Why would she do it? And why did she take off all of her clothes before doing so? After a full investigation, I didn't hear much about the case again. The investigators thought the circumstances were odd, but odd things happened in Mineral Wells all the time, and they were just pressing cases. This case was eventually closed. I didn't hear anything about it until about 5 months later, as I was poring over manuscripts at the Historical Society's archives. Then I came across a passage that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Here's what it had said. One story involving the Baker Hotel revolves around a woman known as Virginia Brown. As a resident of the hotel who was the alleged mistress of T.V. Baker, the owner and builder of the hotel, according to legend, Virginia was upset over the affair and drunkenly plunged to her death after jumping from the 13th floor. Many visitors to the hotel before it closed in 1972 have reported seeing a dead woman, sometimes wearing a red dress and sometimes not wearing anything at all. She roams the halls after midnight. This freaked me out, and I was about to note right out of there, but I've suddenly realised there was a reference to another document. It turned out to be the hotel's ledger from the mid-1900s. I searched for Virginia Brown's name and found it. She'd become a resident at the time, and there was a notation under the room heading, Room 714. It was at this moment that I realised that there was something seriously wrong and strange about Mineral Wells.
I've got a story that I rarely tell, because it always freaks me out. At the time I was 18, just graduated high school. I didn't go to college right away. I actually took a break and picked up a second job instead. For my second job, I worked a third shift, 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., with 4 other people on a rotated schedule. No more than 3 a night, sometimes 2. After a few months, I became friends with my coworkers. We'd take smoke breaks and eat lunch in the back, play music, etc. Honestly, it was a chill job and I actually liked it. Working at night can mess with your brain though. I realized that. However, my body had completely adjusted and I was always energetic and ready to get the shift done. At this point, I should probably say that when we worked, all the doors were locked and there was absolutely no way to go in or out without triggering the nightly alarm that automatically sets. One night when we showed up, before our manager left for the night and locked up, He told us it would only be my co-worker, I'll use the name Mike, and I, as our scheduled third, we'll call him Jake, called in sick about an hour ago. Me and Mike had no problem. I was probably closest to him because he was my age, and I had my dad as a teacher at his school. We start our usual routine with walking around the store with my manager to ensure nobody is there. Then we check the alarm and watch him lock the doors on his way out. We decided the first order of business was to smoke a cigarette in the back of the warehouse. The smoke detector was a good ways up, and we never had an issue with setting it off. Now, here's what gets wild, so stay with me. Me and Mike pulled the pallet stacked with boxes out from the warehouse and onto the main floor. I grabbed a dolly with some boxes of dried goods and headed to a different aisle so we could be ahead of schedule. We always typically split up for efficiency. About 15 minutes pass and I head back for more boxes. The pallet was in the central point in between us. Neither of us were in the same aisle as it. When I got there, I saw a bag of chips and dip opened on the pallet, with obvious dip marks in the dip. Now, we often ate food and left cash at the customer service desk. Our manager was okay with it. Mike met me at the pallet as I was loading up my second trip. I jokingly made fun of him for getting chips and dip because it seemed like an odd snack during work. He looked me dead in the eye, and I saw his face visibly change and say, "Oh man, that's yours." Apparently, my face did the same when I told him it wasn't. Obviously, Jake was there pulling a prank on us or something, and the manager went along with it, right? Well, no. At this point, we decide to be logical and check the store to catch whoever is doing this. We both have goosebumps the size of mosquito bites on our arms as we try to laugh it off. But something just felt off. Way off. It just seemed a little colder and we were both on edge. We sweep the warehouse in the back and the break room and we don't find anything. No dice. As we get to the front of the store, there's only one entrance to the store, and it's right near all the 12 registers we had. In the front, there's big metal racks where we sold charcoal for grilling, and also those big logs that burn really slow so people that can't survive on their own can escape the city and enjoy campfires. As we walk inside of it, we hear a whoosh and 3 logs flew off the shelf. Now, I'm not going to lie to you here. I screamed, and Mike jumped. We were freaking out at this point, but I stopped and convinced him to walk to the shelf with me, about 15 feet away, so we could check and make sure the shelf was sturdy. With 2 adults, over 170 each, we couldn't budget. Something threw the logs off in front of our face, and as we walk around the store again, trying to find somebody, we don't find anybody. We decided the best thing to do was to continue to work and listen to loud music. We ended up working together the rest of the night. Now, here's the craziest part. We got done a little early, so at 4:50, 10 minutes before day shift came in to relieve us, we started goofing off on those electric scooters for the handicap that were parked in the front. It's critical that I tell you the front had big glass windows, so you could see both in and out from the parking lot. We kinda just didn't talk about what we saw after it happened. I went to sleep that day and woke up to a call from Jake. He sounded like he was having a panic attack. His mom, who worked there during the day, was one of the ones that came in at 5. She was older. Working there was more of a way to keep busy than out of necessity, I think. Jake told me on the phone that when I left, his mom started talking to him in the office, where we clocked in and out. She asked him, "Who is by the door in all black watching you guys on the scooter?" Needless to say, I couldn't sleep. Mike and I never worked alone after that. Later on, I found out that his family had a history of weird experiences like this. Whatever happened that night scared the hell out of me. It wasn't after me, but to this day, I still get spooked.
I live deep in the Alaskan bush. I grew up there. For those of you who don't know what the bush is, it's basically where the mountain men are. They're all extremely self-sufficient. Anyway, I was born and raised on my grandpa's homestead. They migrated from Norway and somehow got the idea to live there. Some things about my grandparents. They're both very much of the old ways. They believe in the spirits. Also, they're very used to living off the land. Now, when my grandparents moved to their homestead, they made friends with our closest neighbours who are a few hours away. They are a tribe of Native Americans who refer to themselves as the Dene. I think my grandparents got on well with them because they had similar beliefs. Anyway, I remembered waking up in the middle of the night out of a heavy sleep, not groggy at all, like I'd just been awake for hours. Normally I'd go back to bed, but for some reason I felt the need to get a drink of water. I wasn't even thirsty, I just felt the need to get a drink. I remembered opening the fridge, grabbing the jug of water and pouring myself a glass. I don't know how to explain this part. I tried to put it into words for 15 years. I felt a compulsion to look to my right and just out of the kitchen window. I wasn't forced or anything, it was just a nagging feeling. That's when I saw it. It literally gives me nightmares to this day. I thought it was an animal at first, unlike anything I'd seen before staring directly at me. It had the antlers of an elk, but its face was messed up. It was almost demonic looking. Its eyes giving away that it wasn't normal. It had forward-facing eyes, almost like a predator. It was very dark and I could barely see, but it had milky white teeth. Its mouth was in fact moving, but I couldn't hear what it was saying. It just stared at me. I wasn't afraid. It just felt like the sense left my body. I stared back for about 20 seconds, turned round and went to bed. I was just confused out of my mind. I was sure that I was sleeping this. I knew it wasn't anybody messing with me because how far the house is away, or if they were, it was very strange. The next morning I heard my father cussing and yelling, telling my uncles to grab their rifles and hunting gear. We had this big insulated chicken coop that could pass as a barn anywhere else, that we chained up every night so wolves or bears wouldn't get in. Well, something smashed into that coop and killed all the chickens. It's never happened before and never since. I remembered that as all of this was going on, I saw some of the tribe men talking to my grandfather. No big deal. They stop by every once a week to check up basically. My dad is still shouting and annoyed. I think it was an animal that I saw last night. My dad starts asking me for the details when I explain what I saw, and my grandfather and the Native American men immediately stopped talking. They came over and asked me to be very specific. I was sure I was dreaming about it being 9 yards tall. They then started talking amongst themselves and to my grandfather for a bit and said they'd be back ASAP. When asking what the hell was going on, we were told that we were visited by a paranormal spirit and that it was very dangerous, and out of respect that they would not talk into any more detail about what had happened. We were told never to talk about it, since speaking of it gives it power. None of us had this, but I had to get it off of my chest. I now live in the southwest US now, but to this day, I will not go into the forest alone or for extended periods of time. I was almost certain that what I saw was just in my sleep and not real, but thinking of it, who knows what could be out there in the wilderness like that, miles away from people and civilization. This happened many years ago when I was an undergraduate student. I worked at a well-known convenience store chain. This particular Monday night, I was working until 11 PM, so I was the only employee from 9 on. It was an older store, so space was very limited and cramped. The only cameras were aimed at the cash register. The store was located between the university classrooms and the housing. It was close enough to walk from campus and back to get snacks and drinks between classes, is what I'm saying. But business was fairly slow after 9 PM during the week. Now I was stocking the shelves when a man entered. He wore a brown jacket and faded blue jeans. He went to the back of the store by the beer coolers. He was wearing sunglasses when he came up to the counter with a 12-pack of beer. Now my hair rose on the back of my neck. It was dark out and the customer put on sunglasses. Suddenly, he pulled out a gun and aimed it at my face. He told me to empty the till. He didn't ask about the cash drop or safe. He grabbed the cigars on the counter and told me to empty the overhead cigarette bins and lottery tickets and took my wallet. I sure as hell thought I was gonna die when he made me lie on the floor behind the counter. I just closed my eyes and started praying. I exhaled a huge sigh of relief when I heard the doors open. I worked at an outdoor mall in a great neighbourhood. You'd assume that it'd be safe as hell there, but then again, you can't be sure anymore. There are creepy people everywhere and I just can't help shake the feeling that this isn't my last encounter with this guy. So I'm a 19-year-old and I work at a kiosk. It's usually teens and young adults and occasionally some older adults that shop with us. There is this one guy, however, who is very recognisable. He does come in pretty often. He always has the same leather jacket, crinkle corner of his eyes, one front tooth shorter than all the others, and he slouches in some weird way when he walks. Now he's usually just harmless, but my god has he made me feel uncomfortable the last couple of times that he's been here. I greet every customer with, "Hey, can I help you find anything?" And most of them tell me that they're just looking. He always just smiles at me and says, "Just looking, darling." I can imagine that. God. At first it was fine. I didn't care whatsoever. He seemed like a harmless 50 or so year old man. He spent a very long time looking at the display cabinet and never bought anything though. Now I usually do the night shift when I'm working here. I'm usually on my own in the back. There's the odd friendly security woman who stops and has a chat with me, but she comes by every half an hour or so, so there's very few people where I am, and the only other stores in my view are a Reebok and Mackey's. Now a few nights ago while I was sitting at the kiosk bored out of my mind, the security lady had already continued on her way. I scrolled through Reddit and was getting ready to open up Netflix and continue watching some shows. I suddenly hear footsteps coming up behind me. I look up and see the creepy man staring at me, but he's not actually at the kiosk yet. I wave at him and he gives me this little smile, but the one that sends chills up my spine. It's almost a very unnatural smile. You can tell that it's hiding something. A customer walks up and I immediately jump at the chance to help them, trying to shake this feeling I'm having. Now I just finish up with that customer and write them a receipt. I then glanced up quickly and see that the guy's still staring at me. Before I could say anything, he started walking over. He's taken my eye contact as permission to come and join me. "Evening, darling," he said, doing almost a bow. "Good evening," I told him. He then proceeded doing his normal, checking out the display cabinet and not actually buying anything. He then started asking me questions like we were lifelong friends. "So darling, do you have a boyfriend?" Now at this point, I'd been single for about a year. I told him no. I didn't have a boyfriend, but there was a checkout girl that I thought was pretty cute at my local grocery store. "I see," he said. "Do you have any plans after work?" he asked me. I'm getting uneasy at this point, but I told him yes, I was going to a party. "You gonna hook up with any boys?" he asked me. My jaw dropped. Whether or not I was hooking up with any boys was not in the line of question. Because I told him no, he smiled and said, "Good, you're too pretty for them boys anyway." He faced me up again and came to hug me. At this point I hadn't realised that my heart was racing, and it became apparent because I couldn't breathe. Before I actually could tell him to do anything, the security woman Linda walked up and glared at him. "Sir, if you're not going to buy anything, stay away from this young woman. I suggest you go loiter somewhere else." He stiffened at the sound of Linda's voice and he left. "You alright, honey?" she asked me and I shrugged. "He's always here," I told her and she shook her head. "Let me and Russ walk you to your car after work, okay?" Now the rest of my shift goes fine. I get through it and manage to make my boss some more money. At 10 o'clock on the dot, Linda and her boyfriend Russ are at my kiosk. They wait for me to pack up and take my purse and then walk me to my little Prius. They waited for me to drive away as well. On my way to the party, I stopped by a gas station to fill up the tank. As I'm waiting for it to fill up, I see the man from the mall at the mini-mart. He's buying a pack of cigarettes and he looks out the window and sees me. When he does, he smiles and waves. He holds up one finger asking for me to wait a minute. I don't. I yank out the fuel hose and jump in my car, booking it out of there. I took several detours before arriving 30 minutes late to the party. I had to make sure that I lost him before showing up. Now it's been a few shifts since and I've not seen him, but I'm almost certain that he's gonna come back for me. This time, I don't know if it's gonna be at my work or even worse. So a little backstory before I tell you one of the most crazy experiences of mine that happened during my 2-year security career from 2013 to 2015. So I'm a 6'7" male and I live in Australia. I'd like to think that I'm a fairly tough individual and I don't get easily intimidated, but some of the stuff that used to go on at the mall that I worked at for the night shift still gives me goosebumps to this day. So the mall that I worked at was very, very large, probably the largest in my state. And all the way up until about 8:30 PM, it would still be quite busy. It was only around 9:30 we would manage to usher all of the stragglers out, and by about 11 PM, all of the business owners would have to leave. My job at this point was just to patrol the mall and make sure nobody was sticking round. Now, we weren't allowed to have any weapons. The only thing we could carry was some mace. Now, there were multiple occasions where we would find would-be thieves hiding around trying to break into shops after dark, but they were normally far outnumbered by 4 or 5 of us on the shift at the time. Usually without fail, they just turn themselves in and not want any of the hassle that would come with fighting us. However, on this one particular night shift, things started getting really weird for me. I'd say it was about 2 o'clock and I was standing in the middle of the empty food court eating a sandwich. This was the only part of the mall that had any light at night time due to the skylight, so it was comfortable to eat there. While I was eating though, I heard a dull scraping noise from the hallway leading off to the food courts and to the toilets. It really sounded like somebody was dragging a piece of metal on the floor. I was immediately put on edge by this and I flicked on my torch without a moment's hesitation. I can remember creeping down the hallway, flashlight in hand, illuminating a good 6 or 7 meters in front of me. As I got closer and closer to the end of the hallway, the noise became louder and louder until I was at the very end of the hallway, and there was the toilet doors to the left and right of me. I could tell the sound was coming from the female toilet, so I stood there for a second in hesitation, then I slowly gripped the handle and opened the door a tiny bit. The noise was not very clear and it had me very scared. I'm confused, so I yell out, "Oi, who's in there?" The noise suddenly stopped. I paused a moment, listening hard through the tiny crack of the door, and I swear to God I could hear breathing, low male breathing. I then shut the door, still gripping the handle, and flicked on my radio. "This is 1-3, I need help in the food court, somebody's in the bathrooms here." No response. That was really strange and it put me further on edge. Policy was to always answer the radio without fail, so for it to be so silent, that was quite alarming. "This is 1-3, anyone copy?" Still no response. I can remember whispering to myself, "What the hell?" I again hesitated but decided to creak the door open a little more. I then said, "Listen mate," trying to sound as intimidating as possible. "If you don't come out with your hands up, it's gonna end with all of your teeth coming out, alright? Do you want that?" I sat there at the door, quite honestly terrified at this point, but there was no response. In fact, there was no noise at all now. I then yelled into the bathroom, "Okay mate, I'm coming in. If you do anything stupid, it's not my fault, you're never gonna walk again." I tried my hardest to sound scary, but my voice was quivering at this point. The whole situation made no sense. Why would somebody be lingering around in the female bathrooms? Why couldn't I have gotten any response on any of the radio calls I made? What was that metal noise? What was happening? I then very slowly and cautiously opened the door. I scanned my flashlight slowly across the room. All of the cubicles were now weirdly open. Other than that, the room was totally empty. I was absolutely terrified about now. I definitely wasn't losing it. I then walked into the center of the bathroom, closing the door behind me. I was so scared to the core that I actually let out a sound. I then said aloud, "Come on, this is like horror movie stuff. This is really messed up, just come out." When I then heard the long, whining squeak of the door behind me close, I span around, basically crying at this point, and shone my torch onto a massive man. He was at least a foot taller than me. He had his matte grey hair and he looked to be in his 40s or something like that. He had some dirt on him too. He was mid-opening the door, but he stopped dead in the middle of his action. He then looked at me, smiling this guilty smile like a kid would when they get caught stealing biscuits or something. I'm not gonna lie, I was scared froze. He lifted his fingers up to his mouth and ushered for me to be quiet. He suddenly swings the door all the way open and sprints out with this small metal box in his hand. I was just totally at a loss. Turns out he was just behind the toilet door while I was still opening it, and I totally missed him. I was so close to him and I didn't even notice. He could have killed me if he had a knife or something like that, and this still haunts me to this day. Later that night, my radio miraculously started working again, and right on the cue, I was able to tell my co-workers my story. They collectively went pale when I told them what happened. They all had similar stories, but none quite as terrifying as mine. I worked the night shift for another week before I quit. I'm not sticking around a job like that, and I needed help, and why was my radio not working? Why could I not get help? Why did I have to deal with that alone? And why was I in such danger? This happened back in 2010. I was working in a hotel in a suburban area. It was a pretty nice place. When I started there, I was both a PT front desk clerk and a PT night auditor. For those of you who don't work in this industry, I closed the day out on the computers and on the night shift. I had just been promoted to a day job and had a week left at the front desk before I was switching to Monday to Friday, and it was just like any other night. At around 3 AM, I received a phone call. There was this guy at my age. He tried to strike up a conversation with me. I give him my name when answering the phone, so he gets my name, of course. He then starts asking me weird questions. He keeps on asking stuff like if I want to go for a drink, etc. They were harmless, but nevertheless, I tell him that I'm hanging up, that I had a job to do. He wouldn't give me a name. Instead, he tells me, "Why don't you call me John?" I hang up and finish my shift. The next night, at around 3:30 AM, I received another phone call from John. He started out by asking me to go for a drink again. I declined and hung up the phone. He called me back about 5 times every night, each time getting more and more weird with the comments he was saying. He ended up with his last call with the phrase, "I love you like singing karaoke. I love doing that. Let's go do that sometime." Things got really weird when he found my Twitter. I'd gone out a few nights prior with my friends and posted about it. I asked him about how he got my full name and he wouldn't tell me. I hung up again, and he was done that night. I deleted my Twitter and the pages. When my boss came in at about 7 AM, I told him about what was going on. We told my GM and the security guard had a report on it. Now I would only work about 2 overnight shifts a week. Unluckily for me, when I came back the next week, he followed. The phone call started again at around 3 AM and lasted for an hour or so, but this time he was a little different. John was angry that I deleted all my accounts so he couldn't keep an eye on me and make sure I wasn't cheating on him. I told him to go away and that I'm not answering my phone anymore. My security guard will be taking all of my calls and I'm gonna forward them. The phone then went quiet for about 10 seconds and then he screamed, "You're gonna be with me if you like it or not. I'm coming for you right now. Stay put," and hung up the phone. I then freaked the hell out and called the cops. Luckily, I had my security guard there so I wasn't completely alone. Now it must have been a slow night because it took the cops only a few minutes to get there. I then called my supervisor who left at 11 PM and he then called the manager to calm me down. One of the cops then stayed with me for the rest of my shift. I told my boss about what had happened, and from then on I only had 1 week left of overnights. I just couldn't do it anymore, and I wouldn't. Thankfully after that, everything stopped. I'm just worried though that he's still out there, and the thing is, even if I leave this job, he's still probably gonna follow me. He knows my name and most of my social media stuff. I just hope that this is the last of it. I was a janitor at my local gym. I was mopping the floors and had my back to the door, listening to my iPod. I turned around and see there was a man there dressed in a super sketchy looking UPS costume. He had his face pressed to the glass door, smiling and tapping on the window with one finger. He starts shouting at me that I have to let him in. He has a package to give me. Now this scares the life out of me. It's 1:30 AM. I told him to go away and called the cops. They then later found him trying to break into a house further down the road. My dad used to work night shifts at an old abandoned complex. Now he was doing a security guard job. The place was supposed to be haunted, and there was this basement area that none of them would go in no matter what. My dad told me that even if they had trouble there, they were just told to avoid it and ignore it because it wasn't actually anybody there. My dad was always confused by this and just thought it was the other guys trying to scare him. So one night, he gets a call saying that there's some disturbances going on and he thinks it is coming from the basement area. My dad was sure that the reason he got the call to go down there was because the guy calling him was too scared to go himself. My dad just called him a wussy and hung up and went to go and investigate. Now my dad said there was something off this night. It wasn't particularly that cold out this night, but from the second my dad stepped outside the warm office, he immediately got goosebumps all up his spine and on his arms. He also felt very uneased. Now he was sure that this was just paranoia because obviously working at night, your mind's always going to play tricks on you, and he began heading towards where the basement was. Now it was quite a walk, so he had quite a lot of time. As he was walking there, he went to radio back to let the guy know that he had just set out, but his radio wasn't working. Now my dad thought this was odd, but because this was a few years ago, he was sure that was because the battery life on them wasn't that good back then, or at least not on the radios that they had. He did eventually get to the basement thing, and he turned back and he could see that one of the guys was watching him from afar. He could see that one of the guys wasn't doing anything, he was just staring. My dad called out, "Yeah, don't worry you wussy, I'm gonna go down there," waved at him and laughed and started heading towards the basement. Just as he did that, he got another call on the radio. He couldn't really make out what it was saying. It almost sounded like whispering, but he was certain that he heard something saying "get out of there." My dad then turned to look towards the basement again. Just as he did that, the door slammed shut on him. "Alright guys, this isn't funny. We're doing a job here, I'm not going to take this off none of you," my dad called back. He went to signal in on the radio to tell the office that the guys were playing tricks on him and to tell him to cut it out, but the radio once again wasn't working. My dad was annoyed by this, and rather than go and investigate what was going on, he was planning to drag one of them down there with him, one of the guys who gets really scared who was playing tricks on him. So he quickly hopped out a window. He then made his way back to where the office was. Just as he was about to knock on the door and go back in, he heard a very loud slam behind him. He turned around to see that the door was now flung open, the one that was locked previously. Not only that, he could see a silhouette standing in the door. "For God's sake, I'm not even there now. Meet me back in the office," my dad shouted out. He was starting to get annoyed at this point. He went back in just to make sure that it wasn't anybody who'd actually snuck in and was trying to burgle anywhere. He quickly went back over the cameras and saw that nobody had entered the site. My dad then went to go and make a coffee and he entered the room. Well, this is the last point he was conscious. He then said that as he entered the room, he saw that every one of the security workers was in there. There was nobody else outside but him at the time. My dad then fainted. That was the last time that he ever worked security again. And not only that, a few of the other guys quit too after. I'm currently a janitor at a gym. We have a stairwell that leads down some stairs to a door that doesn't open anymore because we lost the keys to it years ago. So one night, there's a loud banging coming from the door. It almost sounded like somebody was banging it every couple of seconds for at least a few minutes. I stood at the top of the stairs trying to figure out what it was and just watching, and it suddenly stopped. It then started up again a few minutes later. I went back up there and see that it started again and stops as soon as I get up to where it is. I told my manager the next day and I had a locksmith come in. He got to the door and said that it's just an old empty supply closet. So that means every so often at the bottom of the stairs where I work, there's a banging sound coming from an empty locked room.
This story takes place in August of 2013, in the mountains of South Oregon. I am a USAF Security Forces airman. In other words, a military policeman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick and I decided to go exploring some back roads and get out of the heat in town. South Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days searching on roads that we knew, finding roads that we did not, and driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road that we'd never been on before and began the drive into the mountains. After driving for about an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of any other people in the woods. We rounded a bend into the thick fir woods and emerged into a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noises, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted a bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5", but regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed that he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of colour that was completely out of place in the thick trees. A small, one-man tent was set back in the trees, about 50 feet away from this strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread hit me, and felt certain that there was someone in that tent, and if we could see the tent, they could undoubtedly see us. There were no campgrounds in the area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone camping so remote would be, well, at the very least, a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement, nor hear any strange sounds coming from it. Nick suggested that I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. "Hey, anyone in there?" There was no reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving this strange area. But we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in that tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it just the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the campsite, should there be any need to leave in a hurry. He would be waiting at the wheel, my heart pounding. I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was totally keyed up, with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built, and no wood collected. The tent, oh the tent, it was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave to tell Nick what I had seen. As soon as I left, I heard Nick begin to yell, "Let's go, let's get out of here!" Not knowing what he was yelling about, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat, and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men, and the third person was laying against the window of the back seat. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way that we'd come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still don't know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police and they promised to send a trooper out to check the scene. I received a call the next day from the trooper, stating that the campsite and the backpacks and all the women's clothing was gone, though he could tell that people had been in the area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove, and I have not returned to the area, and do not have any intention of doing so again.
I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's really beautiful with hundreds of miles of national forests. There's some great state parks and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer. I do most of my work online. If I didn't have that, I wouldn't have much going for me. If I didn't have this, I would literally have to move somewhere else. It's one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there for too long. Excluding a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees. The only employment in the area is a Walmart, fast food joints and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's the massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, though to be honest, it's pretty unnerving most of the time. There's no signal for literally miles and it's about 10 miles away from town. In the past there's been lots of vehicle break-ins in the trailheads. The gravel parking lots also are usually filled with litter and broken glass and whatnot, I'm guessing from car windows. There's usually really dodgy people hanging around these trailheads or just driving around on the Forest Service roads. There are really rough roads too, and you'll see these beat up $500 cars just barreling along the roads for maybe a moment of joy. All that being said, it's actually a great place to go camping, however, you have to be very careful. A few years ago, a couple of my friends and I decided to go playing paintball in the national forest. It probably wasn't legal, I know, but we decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so that way we could play the next morning as well. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drive a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, A church group or something had taken up all of the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot that we were familiar with, and it was pretty great to get to. It was getting dark now, so we decided to keep on looking. So we decided for about an hour or so further into the woods. By this time, it's a bit dark and we're getting a bit worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any signal. Wasn't really surprising, to be honest. We then turned onto a road that really wasn't in very good shape. It had a broken metal barrier laid in the woods nearby. That being said, it looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over it continuously. Now our F-150 actually had a pretty high clearance, so we managed to get over all of the dirt mounds. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the other road was pretty much clear of debris. We went onto this one. We drove down that road for a few miles, and we eventually come across a small creek. There were some blue traps hanging over plywood nailed to a tree. It kind of looked odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep on driving around all night looking for a good camping spot, so we left the truck light running and set up our tent. As we were about to set up the tent, we noticed that there was a lot of trash in the woods and surrounding area. I then noticed that there's some green bottle on the floor. After looking closer, I see that it's insecticide. I was really tired at the time, and I just thought somebody had been dumping their home garbage out here, but none of us were weirded out at the time. There was nothing too bad about it, or so we thought at the time. So we set up camp, had some beers, chilled for a bit. By this time, it was probably about 11 PM, and just as we were eating, we noticed that there's a weird faint glow from the other side of the hill. At first, we were convinced that it was the moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It seemed to be a bright light and it wasn't moving. It was kinda like the glow you see over a bright city, and we couldn't find out what the light source was itself though. Since there was no other access to the area, we decided it was not campers. The hill was about a quarter of a mile from our campsite, so we decided to investigate. Under any normal circumstance we wouldn't have went, but we had some alcohol in us, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend Isaac decides to stay put behind and just put some popcorn on. We started walking towards the light source and the situation gets even stranger. All of the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it seemed strange that a beaver would go around doing this in a circle. Jacob and I started talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, due to our fear and drunkenness. As we're almost at the top of the hill, Jacob trips up and lets out a yell. Only seconds after he does so, the light, whatever it was, went out. We then looked at each other and decided that maybe we don't need to see what the light was after all. We walked back in silence, looking back every so often. We decided to turn off our flashlights and just use the moonlight to navigate back to our campsite. When we're a couple of 100 feet away from the campsite, I can see my other friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat and I hadn't seen him wearing this before. For some reason he's carrying his paintball gun. This is a little odd. We said to each other. The fire had started to die down and we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we've probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance that we were, it looked like Isaac was looking at something further off. He kept walking around the site and peering in the tent. When we got back to the campsite, we saw Isaac walk up to the road that we came in on. We figured he was going to use a bathroom and didn't wander through the woods like we did. When we got back though, we sat next to the campfire and waited for him to come back. All of a sudden, he comes lurching out of the tent and he vomits. It's obvious that he's had more alcohol than the rest of us. We ask him why he's been wandering around with the paintball gun, acting all strange like that. Then he comes up with a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it? We go and check the truck, enter the door code and see our paintball equipment just as we had left it before. The keys to the truck were also still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing after we left? I was watching a movie on my phone, then I fell asleep, I guess. But weren't you walking around with the paintball gun? Did you just change jackets? Isaac said that he'd been in the tent the whole time that we'd left, and he'd been wearing that same fleeced hoodie all night. Somebody had been walking around our campsite. It wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us are way too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back towards my house for the night. We didn't bother packing up the tents, we just fold it with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump in the F-150 and drive out. As we approach the hump in the road, we can see that there's something grey blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier is now on its stand. By this point, all of us have sobered up to the situation. Nobody wants to get out of the car and move the barrier. Now, I did have a metal guard on the F-150, so I slowly drive forward, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck, and it falls right off, and slowly we drive over it. We're terrified that it was going to pop one of the truck's tyres and that is it, we'd be done for, not able to drive anywhere, but luckily it didn't. As we drive down the road, we see that there's a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably about 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching a glimpse of it in the moonlight as it's reflecting off the front mirror. I start to drive as fast as I can on the Forest Service road. The other vehicle keeps its pace. It doesn't get any closer though, it just stays 1 or 2 turns behind us. We only see it when the road then straightens out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I start to drive everybody back home, but I decide that it's best to go a different way, just to be safe. I still have no idea what to make of that night even to this day.
2008, Northern Ohio. My cousin invites me to go camping on a trip to see some hidden state park or whatever, and I happily agree because hey, Ohio has to be better than Indiana, right? So I drive out to their house, and we pack up our tent and food and head out to his truck for a few hours into the boondocks. After miles of twists and turns, the road gets bumpy, and I wake up and we're off the grid, like dirt road and grass off the grid. We park the truck and head up into the hills for a couple of miles, and make base camp at the top of a hill, looking out onto a valley with thick trees on the edges across from us. Nightfall comes fast, and when we're around the fire, I ask them what the park is called. Upon hearing me, they break out into laughter and say that we're not in a park at all, but on native land, and that we were camping upon some sacred hill. I call bullshit, but they name a tribe which at the time sounded legit enough for me not to argue against it. It was 1 AM at this point, and we were just chatting around the fire and eating marshmallows, when out of nowhere, we hear a bone-chilling scream. We all grew up hunting and have heard our fair share of animal calls and howls, and yet none of us could agree upon what we heard. If anything, I would say a screaming fox, or maybe a wolf because of how the howl was carried. It goes on a few more times, and our laughter soon becomes uneasy, as it appears to be getting closer to us. The 5th time we hear the scream, it sounded as if it was just coming from down the valley. We all look down in that direction, and I kid you not, out of the tree line, we see what looks like a gangly, thin, naked man, who from this far away seems way too tall to be normal. This thing takes off in a sprint on 2 legs at us, and without any hesitation, the three of us run off the hill and back into the woods towards the car. Being night, it only made the escape more terrifying. As we reach the bottom of the hill, we hear the scream again, but this time it's from where the camp was. None of us turn back to check nor to see if the other two are near. After the fastest 2 miles in my life, we get to the truck and floor it off the land to the nearest McDonald's, where we sat until dawn with no words to each other. We agreed to go back in the morning to grab our things. We do, and to our surprise, nothing had been moved or taken, which seemed weird, because if someone was trying to mess with us, they would have trashed the place or at least taken something. We drove back to my uncle's where we tried to joke about it and just move on. This stuff never bothered me until I saw my friend playing the game Until Dawn, and I became uneasy and how it looked like what we saw. That stuff is real, and I know it's out there.
Hunting is a huge part of culture in Hawaii. Kids often learn from a very young age how to hunt. My cousin, who's in his late 20s, has now been hunting for a good 20 years of his life. He's had some strange experiences in the wilderness, but this one has always stuck with me as the weirdest one. Have you ever heard of a calling spirit? Well, you get the gist of it, and I'm sure that they exist outside of Hawaii. But they're basically like, if you're somewhere in the woods or alone somewhere, if you hear somebody calling your name, you do not answer. Bad things will happen when you answer. Now I'm gonna write the story like he told me. I was around 8 years old when this happened. We had just started hunting. Me, my cousin and my uncle were hunting one evening in Wola. By the time we were done, we were about a mile away from our truck. It was about 9 PM and it was very dark out. My uncle said, "I'm gonna get to the truck, you kids wait here." But my cousins wanted to go with my uncle. I said, "I'll wait here, you come get me, I'm not walking." I was over with walking and my cousin was like, "Are you sure?" Even my uncle said, "You sure you want to wait alone?" I said, "Hell no, but I'm not walking, I'm gonna wait." So he said that he would be back in half an hour with the truck. Not too long after they left, I heard something moving in the bushes. Then I heard my uncle's voice, "Hey Kai, come on, let's go." I said, "Hell no, I'm not walking back." Then my uncle whistled. You know when you're out playing with other kids in the neighborhood and your dad whistles for you to come inside, and you know when you hear that whistle that you better go faster? That's the kind of whistle it was, so I jumped up and started walking. My uncle was walking ahead of me. I couldn't see him in the bushes, but I could hear him because he's saying things like, "You don't want to listen, you're gonna get in trouble." Then he said, "Come on, let's go down here." He wanted to go into the bushes off the path. I knew something was wrong. I said, "But I thought you were gonna get to the truck." Just then, I saw the headlights back in the direction we started. Then I heard my uncle's stereo blasting, the only song that he ever plays when we go hunting. I then start running like I've never run before. As I take off, it feels like there's something or some kind of weight on my backpack. I still don't know what it was to this day, but I threw my bag off. I then run up to my uncle's truck and he says, "Where's your stuff?" I point back to where I was and say, "It was following you." My uncle yells at me and we have to both get in the car and he immediately takes off. Now to this day, I don't know if it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I do know that there was something out there with me and I was not alone.
So, as a kid I lived about 100 miles away from the nearest town, at a house without electricity or running water, which is the works in the Colorado Rockies. This place was in the absolute middle of nowhere, and we frequently sought all kinds of wild animals, ranging from elk, deer, coyotes and cats. Our property and a bunch of other neighbors' properties bordered national forest roads, so to keep people off our road, we had to gate about 1.5 miles from our house that we drove through before we reached our house. This time of year, we are the only people up there, as all the other homes are hunting cabins, long empty by this time in late winter. Now, this was not the type of gate that you could drive around if you forgot your key. There were tons of trees all around it, with barbed wire, ditches and such, so anyone wanting for off-road around it would basically have to build a new road around this gate. Well, one night, my mother, brother and sister and I pull up to the gate, and we cannot find the key. It's gone. So one of us, i.e. me, has to walk all the way back up to the house in the pitch black to fetch the spare key and make their way back down. Now, it's recently snowed in January, and it is totally dark. You can't even see your hands in front of you dark. And with the new snow, you can't hear anything either. There are a few clouds in the sky, on and off to let some starlight through every once in a while. But it's dark, and of course there isn't a flashlight either. So off I go. First you walk through around 200 meters of trees, then it opens up to a huge meadow, which then narrows back down again to trees for another 200 meters, and then opens up again into another huge meadow, which on the other side of is our house. I set out and everything seems fine. I'm just irritated that I have to do this. I'm about 15 years old at the time and a little angsty teen that is peeved off at the slightest chore. I was not thinking about my surroundings in the slightest, but as I'm walking, I get that feeling that I'm being watched as I'm halfway through the first meadow. That deep, creepy dread that something is right behind you, and you can't see what it is, made it 1,000 times worse by the lack of light and lack of being able to hear. My first instinct was to run, but I knew that if there was something, I was just going to provoke it, so I kept going, and then stopped to try and listen, as I heard a crunch echoing my footsteps. Holy shit. This time I walked a little faster, and I knew there was something behind me. It was probably a cat as well, so I just kept walking right into the second bunch of trees before it opened up into a meadow. I could see our house. I could feel the pressure. At this point we were predator and prey, and I could feel the breath on my shoes. So second clearing comes up and I know what the plan is, and I am about to book it. Thankfully, I'm familiar with what to do, and I scream as loud as I can. As I do so, my dogs hear me and they run to chase whatever it is from behind me. They continue running past me and I book it into the house. When I get in, I grab the 12 gauge first and the key second, then pick up the tractor keys and jump in. There was no way I was going to walk that again. As I'm driving back towards the gate, I see the dogs running back. At least they weren't hurt. That could have been extremely dangerous. I also see the tracks. I knew it was a cat. It actually started approaching me from the first meadow and was tailing me for a long time. I tell my family the whole story, and I know that I'm not going to get any sleep tonight. From that day, I refused to be out alone at night in the countryside without a weapon.
On a road trip with a friend, we hiked into the trail in Colorado one evening to camp so we wouldn't have to pay for a campsite. We found a little clearing by a stream. My friend set up the tent while I decided to sleep under the stars. Right as we were getting ready to sleep, another woman showed up and pitched her tent in the clearing as well. I hadn't been feeling well that day.
I'm not really into the paranormal, But I had an experience about 10 years ago that I've never been able to explain. It was fall of 2006 or 7, and I was making the 2-hour drive home from university along rural country roads in northern Minnesota. The roads along this route are paved, and ditches are well maintained. The land just off the right-of-way is forested. For anybody curious about which road I was on, it's Country Road 58, near Two Inlets, Minnesota. I was in a section of roadway with nice long winding turns, and it was very fun driving. It was just dark enough at the time to need headlights to see, and as I came around one of these winding turns, the beam of my headlights caught a humanoid figure standing in the long grass in the ditch, maybe 50 feet in front of my car. As my car turned and my light shone on it, the thing strode gracefully but quickly the 20 or 30 feet into the woods just off the right-of-way. This thing was at least 7 feet tall, taller than a normal man, but standing naturally erect. Definitely not an animal on its hind legs. It was grey with no hair and very thin enough to see its joints. Similar to that stereotypical grey alien type figure, it walked so quickly and gracefully, I'd never seen anything like it. Wildlife typical to that area include bear, deer, rabbits, and the occasional wolf, but I can't think of anything that explains what I saw. After I saw the thing, I contemplated turning the car around to have another look or maybe just find some tracks, but I was in full-on freak-out mode, so I just kept driving. I was pretty shaken up when I made it home. I'll state for the record that I am a Christian, and that I've tended to wonder if I saw some kind of demon or evil spirit. From the feeling it gave me, I certainly don't feel that I saw an angel.
A buddy and I were hiking at dawn during a camping trip. We're walking along a path and I hear a zing like a bird chirp by my ear. A second or so later, a tree kind of pops next to my buddy. It's at this point that there was an accompanying crack and we'd realised that we'd been shot at. We informed the park ranger around noon and he ended up finding an old guy hunting illegally. Not sure if he was charged with anything, but I have no idea why he was shooting that close to us. There were no animals near us. Why would they be? They'd all be scared of us.
I was camping on land associated with the Anasazi, long dead Pueblo Indians that very few people know anything about. This was when I was a Boy Scout. We hiked for a few days and we saw black bears every day. It's normally a somewhat unusual sight and freaked out the adult leaders and caused us to religiously use anti-bear tactics like bear bags. Not totally related to the story, but it slowed us down, which led us to the events here. Anyway, we camped in a wood cabin at the bottom of a plateau, and the local rangers told us a bunch of spooky camp stories about the plateau and its relation to the long-dead Anasazi people. Even their real names is lost to history, as Anasazi is what the Navajo called them, meaning ancient enemies, or those who are not us. Another part of what they told us that stands out is that the Anasazi were obsessed with ravens, and possibly crows as well, and a lot of their superstition revolved around massive raven people and people with raven heads, stuff like that. I completely forget all the other details at this point, as it was well over a decade ago. Anyway, My tent mate is a bit slow, and is also very allergic to peanuts. He ends up eating some of the pre-packaged food that contains a copious amount. That, combined with the ongoing poor planning, fear of bears, and sloppy leadership, causes the adults to decide to camp out on the plateau rather than keep going. On this scout ranch, you're only supposed to camp outside the designated areas and never on the particular plateau, just because of the geography and the environment. But forget the rules, because we do anyway. We set up camp, eat, lay the bear bag, and head off to sleep. That night, though, was the craziest thing. I could hear so much thunder, and so could my tent mate, but absolutely no rain, like insanely loud. My tent mate and I were terrified. It could have been heat lining, but it sounded impossibly close. We're terrified. He, the braver one of the two, actually goes out to check. As he opens the flap, I see the forest behind him. He comes back a few minutes later, and the thunder pretty much stops at the same time. He looks at me and goes to bed without saying anything at all. It's not unusual in itself. He could be pretty slow and non-social, and likely had mild autism in hindsight. But the next day, we wake up and a ton of things popped red flags. Firstly, our tent is facing an open field, which is very strange, because yesterday we both saw Forrest from when he left the tent to check. Second, no one else heard lightning that night, except for us, which was absolutely crazy as it was loud enough to wake everyone on Earth. Remember how my tent mate checked out the thunder as well? Well, he had no recollection of what he saw. He woke up confused, saying that the last thing that he remembered was just stepping outside. The good part though, the guy in the tent next door brought this up before we did. He also decided to get up and check it out, and he claims that when he stepped out of the tent, there were no trees anywhere. Just extremely long, tall pole objects, almost as if there were thousands of stilts. When he looked up, he also said that there was no lightning visible, but it was super bright, full moon on steroids bright. He also claimed that he had seen flying, winged, pitch black objects, bigger than cars, and they looked like they had wings on them and that they were round. He dove back inside and doesn't remember going to sleep or the noise going away. Remember the giant raven myths? I did, and I was scared shitless. I wouldn't have believed him if I hadn't have seen the trees and heard the thunder for myself.
When I was camping 30 years ago with my grandfather, we had both fallen asleep in the tent. I was notorious for having these night terrors about hearing sounds of monsters around us. So on this one particular night, as we were camping, I had just sat. I woke up and screamed to my grandfather saying that I can hear them, they're all around us. My grandfather woke up to comfort me, but then he went quiet. He quickly poked his head outside of our tent. He grabbed me by my arm. He said, "We're getting out of here now." As soon as I got my head out of that tent, I could smell the fire. Turns out there was a huge forest fire only meters away from where we were camping at. Had I have not woken up, we would have easily been killed.
This story belongs to a friend of mine. He told me this once, and I simply have to share it. My friend is of Wuiquinux heritage, a Native American tribe who settled in the Pacific Northwest coast. He is quite a character. For one, he is a whopping 6'10", and has the blackest eyes that you could imagine. He always has this frowning face going on, which makes him even more intimidating. He is everything but a bad guy. In fact, he is the most gentle of giants. He was working at a gas station up in North back in 1992. He has pretty much always worked the graveyard shift, from 11 PM to 7 AM. Business wasn't exactly booming at nights, so he was usually watching TV or reading magazines between customers. And there were a few. This area he lived in and worked in was deeply associated with all things Native American. There was a potent sense of pride in the surrounding communities, but also a very distinct presence of superstition and old traditions. My friend was no exception. He was a firm believer in all things of the old. This made his encounter even more terrifying. One night, he was sitting as usual watching TV when a customer entered the gas station. The customer paid for his gas and a pack of smokes and some soda and returned to his car. Nothing unusual. But as my friend looked out the window towards the customer's car, he spotted what looked like a huge dog sitting by the edge of the woods. Now the window is located out on the side of the building, some distance from the sliding door, and overlooks the pumps and the roof covering it. On the sides of the roof, there are pretty strong halogen lights, which shine in to the gas station. This gives the gas station not only eerie lighting, with the blinds casting long, stripped shadows, but also blinds the teller to an extent. As he peered through the window trying to focus on the dog, it was gone. He didn't think much of it. Even if it were a wolf, he was inside and wolves don't tend to rob gas stations at night. Wolves were common here, but this wolf was huge. He brushed it off and returned to his mindless show on TV. A couple of hours go by, and not a single customer had entered since the last. He was about to refill some condiments when he heard a large thud coming from the back. It wasn't inside, but he could hear it. It came from the back, and behind the building they kept the garbage. The gas station has been visited before by scavenging homeless, but my friend didn't really care. It wasn't his garbage, and it was just garbage. Let them take it. But it kept getting noisier. He decided to grab a flashlight and a gun from the office and circle around the back to tell whoever was venturing there to leave. He had had enough. His presence alone would have scared off anyone, but he wanted to feel safe just in case. He exited through the sliding doors, walked past the window he was sitting by, and as he turned the corner, he shines his light towards the dumpster. As the cone of light hits the dumpster, my friend instantly drops the flashlight and the gun. It's the huge dog he saw before, scouring through the garbage. It wasn't a dog though. It clearly stood on its hind legs, reaching the same height as himself. It could not be a bear. It was too gaunt. The creature's eyes had been glowing in the light of the flashlight, making it even more terrifying. He ran inside the gas station, and he wasn't followed. He locked the door and stayed in the whole night, and quit the very next day. My friend is still convinced that he saw a skinwalker, a shape-shifting shaman of sorts that are common occurrences in Native American lore and culture. I don't think he ever plans on working nights again.
Not long before the summer of 1996, my parents decided that I was going to summer camp. My input was not taken into account. I was overweight, becoming more so every day. They thought spending some time in the great outdoors was going to fix all of this. I did have one friend, Max. My parents convinced his mum and dad that Max should accompany me. Max was overweight like I was, and he hated the idea just as much as I did. We begged and moaned to our parents, but it didn't make a difference. Max's parents had a home in Val, and they decided to go on a camping trip in Colorado. Calling the camp rustic was a gross understatement. The cabins had no electricity or running water. The showers had to be used sparingly, and they weren't exactly hot. And the thing was, it was supposed to be at the discretion of the campers. I never understood this. The daily activities consisted of hiking, horseback riding, riflery, rock climbing, rappelling and water rafting. Normal activities for children, but I didn't like any of this. I was overweight. We stayed at Max's family home in Val for a few days before leaving towards the camp. We enrolled for a 3-week term, the shortest on offer. So for several days in Val, Max and I ate as if the world was ending. With any luck, we would come back to our parents only slightly less fat than before when they hatched the plan to begin with. So there we are, we just arrived at the camp, stream of trunks full of clothes and assorted equipment. We had some normal stuff, you know, like backpacks, flashlights, canteen stuff, portable cookware, etc. Now to reach our cabins, we had to haul our trunks 1 mile up a hill. Now, we had no idea in advance just how bad that our accommodations were going to be. We were also practically in tears when we heard that we were only going to be allowed 1 care package during the 3-week term. Our first impressions were unsurprisingly that of a poor one. Max and I both recognised how pathetic our attitudes were eventually though. Our distress quickly disappeared. However, many of the kids in our cabin had similar tastes in music and movies, so we quickly became friends. Our counsellor was a stout hippie named Storm. I don't recall his age, he was likely in his mid-20s. He was a really nice guy, and we just all talked to him straight away. One of our bunkmates had a little more difficulty settling in. He was called Dustin. He was a runt, thin, pale, and sticky looking. We initially thought that he was just painfully shy and that he had some kind of anxiety, but thereafter we realised that he was just weird. He was glassy-eyed and almost looked otherworldly. We did try and connect with him initially, but eventually we just let him fade into the background. Now at night, we would lie in our beds and tell stories for about an hour or so before falling asleep. At this time, Dustin engaged in a weird routine. He would leave the cabin and go walking in the dark. The terrain was very diverse. There was lots of ditches that were actually a few feet deep. There were bear sightings every so often. Now I'm quite sure that there was no shortage of other weird creatures out there, and for some reason, Dustin had his best interest in roaming around there with them. None of these complications deterred him though. Oddly, Storm took no issue with it. "Do your thing, man," he would say to Dustin routinely. About a week or so into our 3-week term, we went on cabin campout. This consisted of an elder of the boys teaming up with the younger cabin. The age range was from 8 to 17 years old, hiking anywhere from 20 to 30 miles away from the cabin and then coming back. Storm was bouncing with the opportunity. He had the perfect spot. He went on to describe a valley that was absolutely bouncing with colours. There was loads of wildflowers everywhere, and it was just beautiful. He called it Horse Mountain. Now we're all fairly certain that this was a product of drug-induced fantasies, but Storm proved us all wrong when he led us to the exact location just like he described. We explored during the day, and at night time, we would huddle around a fire, eat dinner, tell ghost stories. On the 4th night, we implored Storm and Dave, the counsellor of the older boys' cabin who accompanied us, to tell us about skinwalkers. For those of you who may be unaware, there is a legend that the spirits of deposed and murdered Native Americans would disguise themselves as animals and seek revenge by indiscriminately attacking anybody who come across their path. So these are skinwalkers. The counsellors refused initially. The camp had apparently fielded numerous complaints from parents that younger campers were being scared to death by the ghost stories. Now eventually, Dave was the one who broke his silence. Our persistence had paid off. As he began his story, Dustin, maintaining his weird attitude, began standing up, walking around, and Storm called out to him, "Dude, would you at least take a lantern so we can see you?" Dustin obligated and slunk off. The little light from the lantern was becoming dimmer and dimmer as he made his way across the valley. Dave resumed the story. We sat there, mesmerised for what seemed like a very long time. We all sat there, both captivated and scared, till eventually the story come to a close. We just sat there in silence for a few more moments. Then, we talked for a while when Storm abruptly said, guys, where's Dustin?" We were so caught up in the story that we paid no attention to where Dustin was going. We looked in all directions but saw no tiny light jogging off in the distance. "Alright, he probably just turned off his lantern. Wait till he gets back up here," Dave reassured. So we waited for an hour, then another hour. Nothing. At this point, we broke into 3 groups. Max and I attached ourselves to Storm, and we set off down the valley. "I bet a sleepwalker got him," Max murmured. "Stop that," Storm snapped back. It was the first time I'd ever seen Storm say something like that. He'd never been foul before. At this moment, I realised that Dustin could be in serious trouble. We all looked throughout the night. A feeling of panic befell all of us as the sun began to rise. Storm and Dave argued. They should never allow Dustin to go off on his own. After some intense arguing back and forth, they decided that Dave would hike to go and get some help. We all sat there in this terrifying silence and we waited for his return. He come back hours later with law enforcement and mountain rangers in tow. They asked us questions and then instructed us to return to the camp. When it got out how that they let him walk off unaccompanied, the ranger was disgusted. Another was in absolute rage. We then rode by van back to the camp. Storm was asked to leave. Now I don't know if he ever got into legal trouble, but I knew Councillor Dave wouldn't say anything about what happened to him. Now 3 weeks passed and Dustin was not found. The authorities were able to track him up to a certain point, but then it vanished. I regretfully confess that things returned to normal for me and my bunkmates fairly quickly. We were remorseful that a kid our age was missing, but we felt little to no connection with him. We were compelled by the adults around us to try and forget about what was happening and enjoy the rest of the summer. Max and I enjoyed our time there so much that we asked if we could stay for another 3 weeks. Luckily, the camp had the space to accommodate us. Our parents were absolutely gobsmacked but overjoyed. So one day, I was playing football with Dave and got to a group of campers. There was a long field we used for sports which dipped down into a deep integration ditch which was 5 to 10 feet deep, woods laid beyond that. There was not a cloud in the sky. Dave was a quarterback. He was crouched down ready to snap when suddenly he straightened up and squinted into the distance. "What the hell was that?" he muttered under his breath. "Hang back guys," he commanded and began walking briskly towards the integrated ditch. We looked towards the woods and saw nothing odd. There was a strange dark colour mass waving at the edge of the ditch. It would kind of poke up for a second, then quickly dip back down the bank repeatedly. We really couldn't make out what this thing was. We then disobeyed Dave and made out after him. He stopped about 10 yards from the ditch. We went up to him. "Is that an animal?" the campers asked. "Guys, get away from here, that's not an animal." Slowly, the form revealed itself to be a person. It was on its hands and knees. Its back was arched and it had an attempt to stand up but fell straight down. Finally, it did stand upright. It swayed on weak legs. It was small like a woman or child. It was completely covered in mud, presumably from trying to get up the bankment. "Oh my god," one of the campers whispered. It was Dustin. He was covered from head to toe in mud and blood. There was a gash on his forehead that extended from his temple nearly over to the other side of his head. I will never forget that haunting black silhouette against the backdrop of the clear blue sky. Aside from the gash on his head, all we could see was the white of his wide screaming eyes. Dave approached us. Dustin slowly extended a hand. As Dave touched his shoulder, Dustin let out an ungodly scream. He then collapsed on the ground, sobbing and screaming. "Go get help," Dave shouted. An ambulance rushed to the scene and later took Dustin to a nearby hospital. The camp staff were very secretive about the situation. We pled with them to tell us something, anything about what happened. He was a Mountain Dew junkie, so we piled him up with Mountain Dew, but he still wouldn't say. Suddenly, "Look," he said, and beckoned for all of us to sit around him. "I know what happened to Dustin, I won't lie, you know that. But if I could take back what happened, I would. It scares the hell out of me. I'm not going to share it with you, that's the end of." We felt the gravity of his words. We continued to talk about Dustin amongst ourselves but stopped appealing to the adults. Initially, we were almost certain that it was something supernatural like a skinwalker perhaps. As time went on, Max and I consoled with each other the idea that Dustin may have been abducted. He lacked the supplements he needed to treat the water for gangrene and other stuff, so I doubt he was able to survive on his own. Did he stumble upon the wrong person, or wrong people by chance? Maybe somebody deliberately released him this way. I don't know. Max's mother knew Dustin's parents as they were all part of a small community in Val. Many years later, she told us in addition to suffering from shock, Dustin had severe burns on his body that doctors thought were the result of being doused with boiling water repeatedly. His appearance back at the camp 3 weeks later after his disappearance is also a mystery, but it also seems to point to the wickedness of others. Maybe he was returned to show us how bad he suffered. Over the years, Max and I remained friends and we returned to the subject at odd intervals. One time in high school, I brought up Dustin while having dinner with Max and his mother. She made an offhand comment about some people don't have the parental instinct. I pressured her about what she meant. She said Dustin had severe medical trauma and mental problems and his behaviour changed dramatically after the ordeal. His parents couldn't cope with the challenges of raising him and they abandoned him in a psychiatric ward. None of his old friends in Val had even contacted him or knew his whereabouts. If, dear reader, you're looking for closure, I can offer none. Certainly this is not a happy ending, but maybe it can be a teaching moment. I've told this story to dozens of people over the last 2 decades. They always point to the obvious desperate evil and depravity of Dustin's abductors. They never recognise what I consider to be the most disturbing element of this story. Dustin was discarded by the people closest to him, his parents, the counsellors, even us kids. He was odd, but not bothering with him made him even more vulnerable. Even with the noblest of intentions, complacency and distorance can put oneself and the others into the path of ruin. All it takes is a bit of indifference to lead the lamb to the slaughterer.
A Navajo tribal police officer was driving west on what used to be officially named Highway 666. It was lightly snowing, maybe 1/4 of an inch, which was a lot of snow for home, and he sees an old woman walking on the side of the road. How she got there or where she was going was not apparent, because she was so far into the middle of nowhere. He didn't see her right away, but as he passes he noticed that she's dressed in traditional clothing, a shawl, dress, and her hair is in the traditional bun. Not too odd. Many elders still choose to dress traditionally. But why was she out in such cold weather, and at this late at night? Hitchhiking maybe. He passed her too quickly, and now had to turn around. As he made a U-turn, he notices that she's nowhere to be seen. This is a fairly flat terrain, and he's sure that he's seen an old woman walking. He pulls the squad car over and steps out with a flashlight. Confused, he manages to find the woman's footprints in the shallow snow. He stops the footprints until they suddenly turn into what looks like dog footprints leading away from the road in a hurry. He immediately jumps back into the squad car and meets up with another officer near his patrol. He's a little shaken up, but asks the other officer if he's seen anything like that. The officer tells him that he has, and he also explains that sometimes it's an old woman, sometimes a very beautiful young girl, but always on the road and always in the snow, waiting for the right good Samaritan to let her in their car. I still get nervous driving up these wide open spaces at night. I keep my eyes strictly on the road and turn my music up high. I rarely pick up hitchhikers, but I never pick them up at night.
I've always been a bit of a skeptic, ever since I was a kid. Scary stories don't faze me. Horror games have never frightened me, and whenever I hear something weird at night, I instantly assume that it's something normal, you know, just like an animal or something. Despite this, something very unsettling happened to me the other day, and I'm not really sure what to make of it. It's the first time in years that I've been genuinely frightened. So I live in a forested area in the US. Me and my girlfriend live in a large cabin there, and although there are many roads nearby, our nearest neighbourhood is at least a kilometre away. We also have 2 cats, one of which sleeps in the bedroom with us while the other goes out at night and does whatever cats do when they're out of sight. Anyway, I like to stay up late at night and sleep late into the morning, whereas my girlfriend, she's an early bird. So anyway, it was about 1 in the morning. I was watching some crap on TV in the living room whilst my girlfriend slept in the bedroom. I was beginning to grow tired when I heard something outside. Now it was pretty near to the cat flap. For clarity, our cat flap uses an electronic chip, so only our cats can use it. So I just assumed that it was one of the cats coming into our house. I ignored it, but then I heard it again. It sounded like something thudding against the flat. Now this happened a few more times before eventually I just lost my patience. I went straight up to go and open the door. Clearly, this stupid cat was having trouble trying to get in. I never really thought much of it at the time, but this was weird because we feed our cats well. They're very lean rather than chubby. So anyway, with this confusion in my head, I passed the bedroom and I peered in as I walked past. I wanted to see if my girlfriend heard the noises too. She was fast asleep, but the cat that sleeps with us was now staring out the window, wide awake. I called her name. Nothing. She just keeps staring. I shrugged it off and I kept heading towards the kitchen. To be honest, I was getting a little unnerved at this point. It didn't really make sense why my cat was looking out the window like that and also not responding to me. But I eventually reached the back door. There, I saw a dark shape through the translucent cat flap. I sighed, expecting the cat to be out there, and opened the door. It took a moment for the door to open, and I then saw the cat tense up as I opened the door. I opened up the door. I froze. It wasn't my cat. Whatever it was had started moving before I opened it, and I only caught a glimpse of a distorted figure. It was kinda like a tailless dog. Now, this thing was moving quick. I mean bolting, absolutely blazing out of there. I freaked out and slammed the door shut. What the hell was that? I wasn't sure. Then, my natural skepticism kicked in. I just assumed it was my other cat and I merely started laughing. Perhaps the darkness made it appear larger. Nevertheless, I was creeped out, but decided to go back to sleep. But as I slipped into bed, I realised something more horrifying. The second cat was asleep on the rug. It took me a long while to fall asleep that night. Everything seemed normal now. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Well, That was until a few hours later. I woke up to a strange feeling of dread. Something just wasn't right. My girlfriend was fast asleep. I held my breath. I then heard something creaking by the door. It sounded way too loud to be one of the cats. It was as if a person was walking about. I reached towards a bedside cabinet and flicked on the lamp. The room was now fully illuminated. I then saw something standing just outside the open door, staring right back at me. The same twisted figure that I spotted outside earlier. It wasn't very tall, maybe a little over 5 feet, but what was wrong with its face? That was what scared me the most. I only caught a glimpse of it, but what I saw is going to stay with me forever. It looked like a dog, but with an elongated face, almost human-like eyes. You know the weird distorted snow hounds pull when they pissed off? It was that expression. I instantly started yelling profanities as I scrambled backwards trying to straighten myself up. The creature then turned and sprinted down the hall. I heard it dash outside and go past the window behind us just above the headboard. I managed to look out as my girlfriend started to panic as she woke up fully. We both caught a glimpse of whatever the hell that thing was as it dashed into the woods nearby our home. Grabbing my trusty shotgun from beneath the bed, as well as a couple of rounds from the ammunition box that sits right next to it, I ran outside the room in my underwear and rounded the kitchen. The door was fully open. I'd forgotten to lock it when I originally saw that thing. Now I haven't seen it since. We still live in our cabin, but I've got about 40 sturdy locks on all of the main doors and windows in the house. I always check them at night. I also go to bed a little bit earlier than I used to, so I'm asleep when the freaks of night start to wake up. I've read a bunch of stories that I can compare to my story. I guess I saw what you call a skinwalker. I just know that I never want to see it again.
My grandfather told me a story once, as we sat around a campfire in his backyard. In the cool night of the Arizona desert, the horizon was clear, and each star twinkled in a purple sky, with a full flat moon hanging over the mountains. His voice was raspy and gravelly, the result of a lifetime of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his dark, wide eyes as he settled into his seat, ready to tell his story. Way back when I was a boy about your age, I lived outside an Apache reservation with your great-grandfather. He had returned from the war and set about raising horses and cattle on an 100-acre ranch settled between a brambly mountainside with dirt good for growing thorn bush and not much else. One night, my mother was sick, and Pa and I took a trip downtown about 50 miles away, straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek and some old abandoned farmsteads. Pa and I were driving an old Ford pickup truck. I remember it was dark out, inky and thick, with only the lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember when the engine began to splutter, and the truck slowly had to stop. "God damn it," Pa said, guiding the Ford to the side of the road as it coasted to a halt. "Stay here, son," and he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down, and the cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool the engine, and that's when I smelt it. Rotten eggs. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up carrion, like one of those dead, bloated cattle that would drop from the heat and lay there until the crows pecked enough holes into the hide that the whole thing would explode. It stunk, and I gagged. My skin started to tingle too, and the back of my neck felt itchy, and my face started to get hot. The wind stopped blowing. "Pa?" No answer. My heart started beating, and I felt such a fear in me, in my bones and in my chest. Boy, I tell you, I've never felt fear like this. Not until Vietnam. Not until I saw men dying around me. I locked the door and reached over for my pa's door and saw a shadow bound across the road through both dim beams of light, across the partially opened domed hood. There was a creature. You have to understand, there were legends. Old legends. Older than the rock cairns out in the valleys. Older than the crazy horse, than Sitting Bull. Older than the Indian chiefs and their shamans. The Apache, the Hopi, the Cherokee, all of the old tribes and First People. They told tales and old stories about dark Indian magic. A deal made with the old spirits of blood sacrifice to gain power, old power, enough to fight each other, the Spanish, and later the white men that came for their lands and women. They called them skinwalkers, shape changers, old warriors resurrected as skinless men, all sinew and muscle, walking on deer legs with the torso of a man and the head of a coyote, but messed up, with long, malformed snouts, teeth like a Bowie knife, long arms and standing 7 foot, even hunched over they'd gut the old cowboys and white riders. They'd run through bullets, sabers, part the Spanish armor as if it were potato sacks. They could also change their voice to match the person that you knew or might know. That's what I saw. Big and fast, only for a second it ran across the road, and it turned, looked right at me in the cab, right into my eyes, and I swear it grinned at me. I sank into my seat in shock and fear, shaking. I knew death was near. The air was electric. I smelled ozone and brimstone. The air felt like right before when lightning comes and blows a tree into smithereens. I yelled for my pa, but no words came out, just a dry squeak. I was shaking as Grandfather told his story. He was still here, so I know he lived, but the supernatural always fascinated me, and even now, I felt the force of his words. The real power of skinwalkers was the trickery, sure. They could change their voices, but also their skin. That's why the gods took their hide, so that they could take others. Not for long, the legend says, maybe an hour, before the soul of the skin who they were wearing would come looking for their mortal shell before going to whatever hell awaited them. Though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime. 1 second in 1,000 years. My father opened the door and I jerked my head to the left, putting my fists up to fend off an attack. "Son, it's me," my father said, before climbing into the cab. He grasped the steering wheel and pulled himself in, awkwardly jerking himself back into the seat. I cringed in the corner. I looked at him. I looked hard. "Boy, your great-grandfather was a good man. Treated me and my ma right. He fought the Nazis and saw the worst of the men in Poland when he freed all them camps. And now I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I make a run or do I die? Is this him or not? Let's go get that medicine for your ma." As he pulled the truck into gear and pulled it out onto the road, and our trip resumed. "I guess it was him after all," my grandfather said. "But how did you know? Was it because he said something about your mum?" "No, boy. I knew because out the window, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the beast running 50 miles an hour right next to the car, looking at me with those yellow eyes and a grinning mouth. I looked and saw it, hunched and angry, running next to us." My father kept his eyes on the road, locked straight forward. He said to me, "Son, don't look at it. Don't look at it." And that's how I knew.
Hi, I'm about to tell you a story that's absolutely true. My grandfather lived in Mighton, Utah, and he told stories about skinwalkers and how they could take form of any animal or anyone you knew. I asked him one day, "Did you ever meet one?" And he told me, yes. I asked him when. A very long time ago, before you were even born, before your mother was born. It was when I was young and foolish. I went to the valley, the Skinwalker Valley. It's a valley where life never enters, not even the crows. The very guardians of death will never go there. They too fear the evil that lives out there. He continued with his story. I went out there to show people that nothing evil existed in the valley, nothing but their fears, but I was wrong. He went on that he had gone to the Skinwalker Valley in his old red Ford truck to prove to everyone that what they thought they knew were just stories used to scare them. When he reached the valley, he remembered the grass was black, as if it had been burned and survived the fire. The trees looked dead, but were still alive. He told me he had seen a house not far from where he stood. It was an old house, and its roof was caved in. The door was gone, so he walked towards it, and there were strange marks on the side of the house. Animal skeletons were strewn all about the property, as if there were a sacred burial ground. Then he heard her, his grandmother. She had died a long time ago, but he heard her. The spirits were calling for him, for his life, for his skin, for his blood, and for his soul. They were the lost souls. They could change form from man to beast. They chased and scared him, and told him that they would never forget him. Whenever I visited my grandpa, he would show me something that was brand new, but had been broken the next day. These spirits would kill his animals, so he finally stopped keeping his dogs outside. It got to the point where I snapped at him, telling him that his stories were lies. I told him to prove it. He turned around, pulled his shirt up, and all I could do was gasp. I looked at his back. It was torn here and there. Not one part of his back was unmarked. There were wide claw marks, too straight and too far apart to be made by any human. I was scared and started to cry. I remember my mother running to see what was the matter. She screamed and ranted at Grandpa as he told me. She screamed and ranted at Grandpa as she told me. She screamed and ranted at Grandpa as she held me. But he did nothing but stare at the field across the road from his house. She finally gave up and carried me inside. But as I looked over my mother's shoulder, I saw it. A large, black dog with white eyes. It was watching Grandpa, and he was watching it as if he was waiting for it to attack him. It never did. I never saw that dog again. My grandpa died 2 months later. The doctor said his heart gave out, but I knew that was a lie. His arm had fresh claw marks. That was 42 years ago. No one has ever believed me, but it's a true event, so I'll tell you that the world would know. Never look into a skinwalker's eyes. It will never forget you. If you do, sooner or later it will have your soul. You can fight and refuse to give in to a skinwalker's power. But if that's the case, then I hope you're not afraid to die.
It's an experience he had with a skinwalker on the Navajo reservation. When I was about 11 or 12, we lived in a small house made out of mud and stone, a lot like the house we have now. It was 2 of my brothers and I in the house at the time. Everybody else had gone to James Fest, and that left us to tend to the sheep. We were getting ready for bed when we suddenly heard the dogs going crazy outside. Thinking it was nothing more than coyotes howling in the distance, we just told them to be quiet. We began to drift off into sleep, and the dogs would not shut up. Somehow, I was able to go to sleep for a few hours. Then I woke up later into the night. It was very quiet and still in that house, save for my brother snoring and breathing. I realised soon that I needed to use the outhouse and woke up my brother to take me there. He teased me about being scared, which I certainly was. We went out with our flashlight to the outhouse. The dogs began with their crazed barking and started snarling. They were going from one place to the next, just rushing to the bushes. I was now waiting for my brother to come out of the outhouse as he went first. While waiting, I tried to follow the dogs with my flashlight. Suddenly, there was a very loud whine from one of the dogs. Then everything went quiet. It was really too quiet for that time of year. Not even the sheep were making noise. Suddenly, I heard a few of the dogs going completely mad by the truck. When I looked over, there was this man. He was unbelievably tall, leaning one arm on the cab roof of the truck. He was looking at the dogs a little, suddenly kicking one of them. They all scattered into different directions. The thing then looked up at me and I saw its face. It was a pure white face like a full moon, with two burning red eyes, a slight smile that was pure black. I couldn't move or make a sound. This thing, whatever it was, then began making very tall long strides towards me, until it finally towered over me. As soon as it approached me, all I could see was a colour of blood red. I kept getting deeper and deeper lost into its eyes. I could faintly hear my brother coming out of the outhouse. With this, the thing looked up at him. Reality came rushing back to me. I noticed that my brother was too distracted with his buckle to realise what was going on. I then realised that this thing had its horrible looking, long fingernails, just inches hovering above my head. Its skin was black ashy, and it smelled like a bloated dead animal in summer. I was still unable to move or speak. The skinwalker began moving towards my brother now. Finally, noticing this, my brother became just as paralysed as I was. Closer and closer it drew, reaching an extended arm out towards my brother's head. Suddenly, something finally snapped in me. I became unbearably angry. I broke from my trance and lunged at the skinwalker, raising my arms like a wild animal, baring my teeth at it. A growl came out that I knew I couldn't have made normally. I became more and more angry at the thing trying to hurt us. I kept that smile at first, but the angrier I got, the more my smile faded. Finally, with everything I had, I began to make this primal roar at it. It fell backwards and ran away into the night. The next morning, my family returned from the fest. After replaying the story to my parents, they quickly hired a medicine man. For some brief context, I'm a 22-year-old female, and the following events occurred when I was 19 to 21. When I moved away for college, I started talking to the Catholic priest, Father Gabe, who ran the chapel and women's shelter behind my dorm building because something scary happened to me, and I really didn't know who else to talk to. Plus, he was literally like 100 feet from my bedroom window. Anyway, long story short, Father Gabe is the exorcist for the vast surrounding areas. He's also a demonologist and he was born and raised in Rome. He studied there. He's also super old, like 87, and he's super broad-minded as well considering that he's a priest. I feel the need to specify that I'm not an overly religious person. I'm more spiritual, and my basic belief system is that there's something greater than us that our minds just can't simply comprehend, and that this entity we label as God, well, that's there and it does exist. There are things that are beyond our control that are sometimes malevolent. Now, demons isn't really the right term for them. It's the only term that we've come up with, but they are very evil. So basically, I think that every religion in the world has a piece to the puzzle, but none of them paint the whole picture. Last, it's important to explain the reason I began working with Father Gabe on his cases. For the sake of space, I'm going to be very clear. I have a sixth sense and my connection to the other side has always been very strong ever since I was a small child. It runs in my family on both sides, so I guess you could say I was kind of physically born into this, for better or worse. I told Father Gabe about this, and after testing me numerous times, he asked me to help him with an extremely violent case. I agreed, and without much hesitation, that's where my story begins. The victim of this was a 7-year-old boy. For his own privacy, I'll just call him Danny. Danny's been acting very strange for the past few months. His parents had taken him to numerous doctors, psychologists, specialists, etc., but they were never able to diagnose anything wrong with him. His mum Sarah was a nurse and the family wasn't particularly religious, but Sarah's parents were convinced that they had to take Danny to the Baptist church and they needed to see the pastor. Though the pastor knew that something was horribly wrong with this kid, but he didn't have the necessary skills or knowledge to help him. That's when Father Gabe got called. Now the memories are kind of fuzzy. It's been a few years, so I really can't remember Danny's whole story, like when the weirdness started and how things escalated to the point that they did. But I do remember listening to an audio recording of Father Gabe's first interview with this kid, and there were multiple voices talking with some different languages. Just unnatural weird stuff. Anyway, I'll skip to the investigation proportion of this story, although a lot of crazy stuff happened then. It wasn't like the actual exorcisms. It's just weird. Now I'm going to go into detail with the most intense, terrifying parts and gloss over everything else. So the first exorcism attempt. Danny is strapped down to his bed with hospital restraints and hooked up to an IV because he stopped eating and drinking. Sarah, being a nurse, was able to get these things fairly easily, so I went there thinking, oh that's alright, we won't have to hold him down like in those crazy movies. But I was so very wrong. Real quick, the way a Catholic priest's exorcism goes is sort of like a mass. Basically, there's a part where the priest says that they're gonna do a part called the Congregation. It's mostly just echoing whatever the priest says, and Father Gabe performed his in Latin. It can be done in English though. So Father Gabe starts reading from his Roman rites book, and the younger assistant priest, Rendell, as well as myself, were all reading along with him. Not even a page in, the kid starts struggling violently against his restraints, and when he realises that his wrists and ankles are strapped down, his spine bends backwards to the most unnatural arch that I've ever seen before. His face was almost against his stomach. He bites the IV connected to his arm and tries to rip through it with his teeth. I'm not lying, blood splattered everywhere and was spraying from the bottle like in a horror movie. I then had to drop my book to go and help Father Randall. That's Roy, Danny's dad, and Hurdle, Sarah's dad and Danny's grandpa, hold Danny down while his mum was bandaging him up. Skip forward to the fourth attempt. We're all worn out. Danny obviously the most, but we have to power through. So we start the exorcism and things start going crazy. The power goes out and one by one the candles in the room are blown out. Now I'm afraid of the dark, so the moment this happens I'm already on my knees trying to find my flashlight, desperately searching. I do find it quick though, but by then the room is pitch black and strangely silent. My hands are shaking as I fumble around trying to turn on the flashlight when suddenly I smell rancid meat and a deep, guttury voice asks me in a mocking tone, "Are you afraid, Noel?" Directly into my ear from just over my shoulder. This made me instantly leap up and let out a really loud scream. I was terrified, dropping the flashlight to the ground in the process. When it hits the ground, it turns on and the beam of light darts around the room, bouncing off everything, briefly illuminating Danny. He's now standing in the centre of the bed staring directly at me. He has the most disturbing smile that I've ever seen. This instantly made me fall down to my knees, and I start blindly feeling around for my flashlight that I can no longer see since it went out as soon as it flicked on. I find it soon though and flick it on to see that Danny's no longer standing on the bed like he was less than a second ago. I shine the light around and much to everyone's shock and horror, we find him crammed into the 1.5 foot wide gap between the top of his bookshelf and the ceiling. His body is contorted and he's crying, confused as to why he's up there, and obviously he's in a lot of pain. All the men help to get him down, and just like that, the power come back on. Now skip ahead again to the 7th attempt. I'm not even sure if this kid is going to survive this alone, and he's just getting more and more terrified and it's leaving me emotionally rattled. We're halfway through the exorcism. I see that the main entity that's been inhibiting Danny's body suddenly appears. It's squatting on top of Danny's chest, staring down at him laughing. Its skin is inky black, so that way it absorbs all of the light that hits it instead of reflecting it. Everything about its body is long and thin. The fingers are long as well, coming to sharp points at the end. Not like claws, just like only continuous pointed digits, if that makes sense. It looked like a skeleton wearing a skin, only much thinner though. Its skin was razor sharp too. Its mouth was full of razor sharp teeth, and its eyes, There are no words in any language on earth that can describe such militia and horror. Already being emotional, I start to lose it. I start to yell at that thing to get off Danny and leave him alone. Everybody probably thinks that I look insane since I'm the only one who can see this thing, but I keep on demanding it goes. Then it looks at me, but I'm so angry that I fight the urge to cower in fear. This time, it just looks at me and it says in that ungodly voice, "Don't get angry, it's all just a game." Then this thing sinks into Danny's chest. He's just absorbed the entity. I'm still working on processing what just happened when I hear a loud metallic snap. It didn't take me long to realise the sound was Danny's right hand restraint buckle, because he suddenly sits up and slowly turns his head until he's staring at me. Once again, his eyes are completely black and his face is scratched into the most horrific smile. There's a tense moment of silence before Danny's mouth opens. In his own voice he says, "Do you want to play a game?" Now before I even get the chance to answer, both the power and candles are extinguished. I feel a gust of wind blow past me and listen as the other members of the party are slammed into the walls and shelves behind us. I'm freaking out by now. I reach for my tiny flashlight that I clipped to my belt loop to avoid being caught without it, and then I realise it was no longer there. How is that even possible? My mind goes into absolute panic as I hear the sound of a metal cap unscrewing and two thunks on the hardwood next to Danny's bed. Flashlights are against the rules, I hear Danny say with a giggle. I'm obviously borderline terrified as I squeak out to Father Gabe, "What are we gonna do?" All I hear is him groan out in pain, and suddenly Danny shouts out, "They aren't allowed to play." I'm almost crying now and I ask, "What do you want?" Another giggle, "To play." Then, on come the lights. I'm almost blinded by the sudden exposure of the lights to me. I can't see a thing, but I can hardly believe what I'm seeing. All the males in the group are pinned up against the wall, obviously unable to move. Sarah and I are just staring at each other with the same scared expression. Suddenly, I hear a low growl come out of Danny, bringing our attention back to him. He just isn't smiling anymore. He looks downright evil. He says, "I thought I said lights were against the rules." He snarls, his voice reverting back to the deep growl one. Now from across the house, I hear Danny's grandpa, Laurie, yell and flip that the circuit board just went back on. Danny flies into a rage. He starts thrashing wildly while yelling, "You broke the rules," over and over again. Sarah and I move forward to pin him down and restrain him once again when he suddenly stops flailing. There's a toxic pause before I hear him whisper in a barely audible voice, "Now I'm gonna break something." And then his body starts contorting in the most unnatural way that I've ever seen. He then twisted and twisted, and it put massive amounts of stress and strain onto his left shoulder, as if he were trying to pry himself out of the other restraint. It then clicked to us exactly what he was trying to do. Sarah and I jumped on him, trying desperately to hold him down. I'm not ashamed to say that by this point I started crying. Sarah and I struggled to stop his twisting body from winding any further, but to no avail. I'm 5'7" and 130 pounds. I'm by no means a pushover, and Sarah was only a little smaller than me, but as we were trying our hardest to push him down, we were both crying, and at this point we realised we couldn't do anything. The one thing about all of this that I will never forget the rest of my life, Danny's left shoulder suddenly caves in, retching downwards into the socket with a sickening, unmistakable pop, and just like that, he was back. The thing left him to feel the pain of the shoulder that he'd literally just dislocated. I've never heard another human scream like that. I doubt I ever will. So, this is where I'll stop. I had many stories, but I just wanted to broad stroke the most terrifying and traumatizing of events that took place. I'm not asking anyone to believe me, but I thought that others might find this story interesting. This world is full of both darkness and light. This experience gave me a glimpse of both.
A year ago, me and my husband bought an old house in the northern part of our country. It is an old farmhouse with the previous residents completely redoing it. There is a large piece of land which was used as an agricultural spot for animals and fruit trees. This plot is more and more transformed into a garden by former residents. A part of the garden is a vegetable garden. I love this garden so much. I lived in the city and had no real talent for plants, but last year I learned a lot about growing vegetables, flowers, and herbs. I love to grow my own vegetables. They taste so much better. In front of our house is a road. One side is toward the center of the village and the other to the next village. The road leads through a piece of nature. It is a big old house with a large garden. It has a lot of windows, sunlight, and warm feel to it. I feel really good, peaceful, and comfortable in our new home. It is big because the former stables are drawn into the house. Our bedroom is the upper part of the old stable. There are windows, and the view is great. My husband and I were in love with the house, and I still love it. My husband not so much. He feels watched in the garden, especially at night, and during the day he gets a strange feeling in the garden. In the evening, and sometimes in the daytime, he pulls the curtains closed in the rooms with the windows to the garden. In summer, he does not like to sit in the garden. The terrace in front of our house is okay, but not the second terrace. And the other part of the garden, this is unfortunate, because the terrace has a fireplace. He will go, but he cannot relax. I teased him often and said that he acted like a little child. I feel wonderful in the garden, and I have no problems with it. I never really believed him until we got a new job. This new job asked him that he must travel sometimes and stay in hotels. These nights when I am alone, I always wake up because of the sound of snoring. I open my eyes and there's a creature laying next to me, asleep, snoring. Sometimes with his back to me, sometimes on the back, and sometimes on his stomach. Once he woke up, smiled at me sleepily, and went to sleep. He does not cause me any harm, except wake me up in the morning. He has green skin, black lips, and large pointed ears, and long black hair. Sometimes it is bound and sometimes it is braided, and sometimes stuck together with many golden clips. His hands are like an animal. He dressed in a white shirt and black pants, and his posture was average. The one time he woke up, I saw all black eyes with no whites, and he smiled yellow sharp teeth. I can see this because I always sleep with the lights on when I'm alone. I never like the dark. Normally I fall asleep again because I'm very tired. I feel spooky but no fear. I do not want to tell my husband because I don't want to frighten him, and I'm sure that he will sell the house. I want to know for sure that it's not a dream, but if I tell him, I'm not sure what he'll do. I hope you can help me. I don't want to lose my house.
I live in a high-rise building. Now the building itself is from the 1950s. There's all kind of stories about how this place is supposedly haunted. I never believed any of this. Well, that is until last night. I was having the worst dream ever. I mean, it was horrible. I dreamt that I was asleep in my very apartment. I woke up and there was a face staring at me through the window. As I went to speak to it, it literally come through the window and started attacking me. Just a second before it actually got to me, I woke up. I was drenched in sweat. Now, all of the lights were off in the apartment. Now that didn't make any sense. I would never do that normally. I always make sure I leave at least one on so I can see where I'm going when I wake up. Out of curiosity, I went to look at that window. You know, just how you do sometimes after a dream. Going to check out the stuff you dreamt about. That was when I had the most terrifying experience of my life. As I went towards that window, I could see that there were two blobs on the window. I thought that they were just hand marks that I had left there from looking out of it earlier. I went to wipe them off, but nothing. I then got some spray and tried still to wipe them off. That's when I realised that the handprints, they're on the outside of the window, and them hands were way too big to have been mine. Also, did I mention that I'm 50 stories up?
A bit of background first. The following story happened when I was 22 years old, so 6 years ago now. At the time, I was working at a psychiatric facility, doing general admin stuff. The area I worked in organized training programs for frontline staff. It was my first job out of university, and I was hired because I had a mental health related qualification, but the job itself had pretty much nothing to do with that. It was really boring stuff, lots of copying, filing, and spreadsheeting, etc. I was the youngest person in the office by quite a bit. I think the next youngest was early 30s at the time, and most people were 40 plus. I got along well enough with everyone, but I didn't really have work friends, if that makes any sense. We had flexible working hours, which basically meant that you could come in any time between 6:30 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. and leave after you'd done your 8 hours or whatever. I was young and quite the night owl, so I usually rocked up at 9:30 a.m. and left at around 5:30 p.m. I was often alone in the office for at least an hour or so at the end of the day, as most of the other staff opted for the start early, leave early approach. The facility where I worked was quite historical. For ease, I'm just going to refer to it as the Center, a collection of heritage-listed buildings, many of which had been repurposed over the years. At the time I was working there, the primary purpose of the center was forensic mental health. So they had high and medium security areas where patients were housed behind secure fences and etc. They also had non-forensic patients and residential rehabilitation units on site. So, this basically meant that a number of patients were free to wander around the place for the most part. Once or twice, we had patients come into our area, but we never had any major trouble from them. The area where I worked didn't have anything to do with patient contact, and our building was on the outskirts of the center, furthest from the high secure area. Our building was a big grassed area out in the back where we were allowed to park, and just to the side of the parking area was an old, dilapidated building that was, probably still is, pretty popular with local ghost hunters. Apparently, they couldn't knock it down because it was heritage listed, but they eventually erected a big fence around it and took the floor in the upper level to deter people from snooping around and hurting themselves. This didn't necessarily stop them though. I remember security being called at least a few times when we noticed people hanging around and trying to sneak in through the fence. The old haunted building had apparently been a ward originally, but had closed sometime after a big flood hit the area over 100 years ago. Now to be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% sure on the accuracy of these details, but from what I was told during the flood, the center was cut off for at least a few days, stranding workers and patients. And during this time, that particular building flooded and a number of patients died. Anyway, regardless of how true the patients dying in the flood story is, the whole place is creepy. It is a historical psychiatric facility after all, and naturally attracts a lot of ghost stories and urban legends. People have of course died over the years, with some standout cases, including a young female patient who was lured off-site by 2 other patients and brutally murdered back in the 80s. So you get the idea, it was an eerie place to work. Our building, like most of the buildings in the center, was heritage listed, and I was told it was originally been a ward for male patients, which they'd repurposed into an office setup. It was divided into 4 wings. The managers had individual offices in one wing, which had apparently originally been solitary confinement rooms. There was an office space next to the manager's wing, which was used occasionally by another service, but they weren't there much, so it was usually locked. Next to that was a main admin wing, where I was working from the time. And finally, the main office wing, where the rest of the non-admin staff worked. Now to travel between these wings, you had to walk outside, as none of them were connected internally anymore. There were old glass doors connecting the couple of areas, but these had been painted over and repurposed as wall space. As you can imagine, staff weren't immune to the eerie vibe and haunted history of the center, and most everyone who worked there had a strange story, or a few, of strange occurrences and ghostly happenings. I've always had an interest in all things spooky, but in my advanced post-university years, I'd adopted a mildly Scully-esque skepticism toward the paranormal. My interest was still keen, but I was no blind believer. The stories were fun, but after working there for over 6 months, often alone early hours of the evening, I'd never experienced anything, especially ghostly. So, with all of that information in mind, I'll get to my story. On the evening in question, I was the last person left in the office, with everyone else having left by around 5 p.m. It was winter, so it was getting dark fairly early. By 5:30 p.m., it was pretty gloomy. Despite a lack of ghostly happenings during the past 6 months that I had been working at the center, I wasn't immune to the creep factor of being there alone after dark, and I was planning to leave as soon as I'd finished a big load of copying I needed to have done by the next day. I was printing a bunch of training manuals, and every so often I needed to go empty the printing tray, as the printer automatically stopped if there was too much paper stacked up. The industrial printer I was using was stored in a room in the manager's wing, so to go collect the printing I needed to walk outside, down a short ways to the entry door to the manager's wing, then down past some offices to the printing room. The first couple of times I walked down to collect loads of printing, nothing out of the ordinary happened. All of the doors were unlocked, so I just walked out with my wing, down into the manager's wing and into the room with the printer, where the door was open. On the third time I went to collect the printing, however, I was troubled to find the manager's door wing was closed and locked. I fetched my keys and unlocked it and walked inside and up the hall to the printing room, which was strangely locked as well. I unlocked the door, collected the printing, the printer was still going at this stage as well, and went back to my wing, feeling a bit uneasy. I reasoned that perhaps the security had come to check on the building and locked up for the night. This would have been very strange though, as the lights were clearly on in my wing and the printer would have been running, so for them to lock up without checking my area, where it would have been apparent someone was still working, would have been very strange. Strange but not beyond the realm of possibility, I figured. So I decided I'd stick around till my print job was done, despite feeling a bit creeped out and starting to consider the possibility that perhaps my colleagues' stories of eerie occurrences weren't just watercolor fodder. After waiting a while, I went to collect the next load of printing. I was shaken to find the door of the manager's wing had been once again inexplicably locked. With keys in hand, I unlocked it, walked to the printing room, which was, at this point unsurprisingly, also locked. I unlocked it, grabbed the printing from the tray, and fled back to my wing with considerable haste, leaving both doors wide and open behind me. Back in the comparative comfort of my work area, I once again considered the possible explanations for what was going on. Again, the only thing I could come up with was that the central security had come in locked up. But whilst that was a possibility, albeit unlikely, in the first instance, it was becoming increasingly unlikely given my subsequent trip to the relocked doors. I really didn't want to go back into the manager's wing again, as by this point, I was truly wigged. By something as innocuous as a couple of locked doors, no less, but despite my rising fear, I needed to grab the final load of printing, and ironically, ensure the wing was locked before I left. I doubted. I was scared of spontaneously locking the door, was going to be viewed as an acceptable excuse if I hightailed it out of there, leaving the printing incomplete and the building possibly unlocked. With the keys in hand, I returned a final time and was initially surprised but relieved to find the door of the manager's wing wide open, just as I had left it during my previous hasty exit. Relaxing a bit, I entered the hallway and walked down to the printing room. However, my heart sank as soon as I saw the door to the room was closed, and sure enough locked too. I quickly unlocked it, ducked in to grab the printing. However, while I was doing this, I heard a noise from somewhere down the hall. It was a scratching sound, and then sort of a murmur. I ran, slamming the printing door behind me. I rocketed down the hall, and I thought I caught a glimpse of something dark, moving down at the end of the corridor. As I ran around the corner and through the outer door, I locked the door quickly, ran back to my wing, dumped the printing on my desk, grabbed my shit, and got the hell out of there. I literally ran to my car. The spontaneous door locking was one thing, but creepy noises, even if it was just my imagination, that was definitely getting a big nope from me. The next day I told a couple of my colleagues about what had happened, and they were sympathetic but ultimately didn't seem terribly surprised or skeptical. It was just a creepy place, and weird things happened there sometimes. After this incident, I tended to come in a bit earlier for a while, so I wouldn't be left there alone at night. Eventually, the fear factor wore off though, and I wasn't too worried about it anymore. There were other occasions during the years that I worked there where strange things would happen. I'd hear voices talking in the next wing to where I was working, even though everyone had left for the day. A few colleagues reported experiencing this too, and odd noises which honestly could have been anything but seemed creepy in context. My uncle worked in the center too for a time, and he recounted how he and a colleague once had been working late at another building on site when they had suddenly heard what sounded like a waterfall roaring down the halls in the room. He said it went for several minutes, and it was deafening, before suddenly just stopping. He never could explain what caused the sound. If I had to put my skeptic hat on, looking back at my printing room experience, I feel like the sounds I heard, the scratching and the murmur, were definitely real, but I'll accept I could have misidentified the sound of something mundane as something more sinister in my already heightened emotional state. I was pretty terrified by that point. To be honest, I probably didn't actually see anything. I suspect it was just likely my fear clouding my judgment and subsequently coloring my memory of the incident. The locked doors, however, 100% legitimate and fairly inexplicable in my opinion. As I said, it was a pretty creepy place. I almost missed working there.
It's almost 5 in the morning right now. I am wide awake. It's the most wide awake I've ever been. I'm an atheist and don't believe in any of this, but what I saw has truly grabbed my attention and chilled me to the bone. I was having a completely random dream. I then woke up, staring at my sliding closet door. The moment I woke up, the closet door slid open, as quietly and smoothly as it possibly could. I jumped out of bed and yelled, "Hey!" Turned the lights on. Nothing. I turned on the lights throughout my apartment. My doors are locked. Everything is normal. I then looked in the closet and there was nothing. I slid the doors open to see if it was a gust of wind, but nothing of the sort was there. It actually made some creaking sounds when I opened it and closed it. How on earth could it have possibly slid open the way it did without making any sound? The other thing that doesn't make sense is my bedroom's at a slight angle. It was literally defying gravity to open the way it did.
During my senior year of high school, I would normally sleep real late into the night. Since my room was on the second floor, it provided me with the privacy I needed, without anyone disturbing my conversations. I was a teenager who enjoyed talking on the phone with friends, and calling from bed was the perfect time to gossip. My younger brother at the time slept upstairs as well, but he slept in the room next to mine. On one particular weekend night, which has haunted me to this day, I was in bed talking on the phone with a friend. Everyone in the household was sleeping since it was late into the night. There was enough moonlight coming into my room that I could make out the outlines of the objects that were in my room. My bed at the time was in the corner of one of the walls, while the door was at the right of my bed. I was resting my eyes for a while during my phone conversation when I had an uneasy feeling. When I opened my eyes, I saw a shadow standing next to my bed. Even with the moonlight, the shadow was dark, and I could not make out any features. I just stood there, while I felt my body freeze in horror. My gut told me that this was a malevolent entity. After staring at this figure for what seemed like an eternity, the entity shifted into a shape. I saw it transform a two-legged shadow to a four-legged creature with a tail. When it did this, it crawled on my ceiling near my bed. My room ceiling is low due to the shape of the roof. There is a slant to the ceiling on the edge, so you can hit your head on it if you're not careful. It is at this moment that I threw my phone. My friend was still on the line, jumped out of bed, and went for the light switch next to the door. I did not look back at the creature out of fear. When I turned on the light, it turned off in a matter of seconds. I turned it back on again and it turned off again. I felt my adrenaline going after I failed to keep the light on, so I threw open my door, turned on the light in the hallway, and frantically knocked on my brother's door. I woke up my brother that night, and although angry as soon as he opened the door, he looked concerned when he saw me crying and shaking terribly. I told him what had happened and what I'd seen in my room, and I quickly tailed him behind into to check my room and retrieve my phone. When he turned on the light from my room, the light stayed on. We did not find anything but my phone still on the bed. Apparently my friend had tried to call me several times after that, but I cut our conversation short due to what I had seen. My brother believed me, probably from the way I was acting and looking, and he wanted to tell my parents, then and there. It was pretty late in the night and I didn't want to wake them. I also knew they were not going to believe me because they are hardcore skeptics. I realized that they were just going to dismiss it as a dream, and I told my brother not to say anything, and I ended up staying in my brother's room that night. I could not sleep at all that night due to the fear and due to the questioning of exactly what that thing was.
Hello everyone, this is a story from my grandmother from when she was younger in the late 60s. She and her friends decided to use an Ouija board to try and talk with spirits. They're all non-believers. So they got ready and all three of them put their hands on the moving thing. They then asked, "Who's there?" And the piece then started moving. Then my grandmother said that she let go and told her friend, "Hey, stop moving it, it's so obvious." And her friend said, "I'm not moving it, you are." And they tried again. This time, they asked it, "Who's there?" And the same thing happened. My grandma told me that she felt terrified. She said she really didn't know what to believe now, and instead of a name, the board spelled out a phone number, and my grandma was freaked out. None of them dared to call it. They asked, "Whose number is this?" Then it started to move once again, and this time it spelled out, "Call this number and tell Joseph not to travel tomorrow." My grandmother and her friends were horrified by this because none of them knew a Joseph, so they tried calling the number, no answer. Again, no answer. So they all decided to go home and call it a night. None of them called, but my grandma did the next morning at around 8 AM. She called and there was a woman. My grandma said, "Hello, can I speak to Joseph?" And the woman said, "He's not here right now, he went to work. Who is this?" My grandma explained the situation and the woman said, "Oh my god, I'll call you back when I've told him." The next day, the woman called up again and was crying. Her husband Joseph died on the way to his work in a car accident that sent him plummeting off a bridge into a river. My grandmother was deeply saddened by hearing this. She vowed never to use an Ouija board again. I got a story that I rarely tell because of how much it scares me. At the time, I was 18, just graduated high school. I didn't go college right away. I took a break and picked up a second job instead. For my second job, I worked third shift, that's 10 PM to 5 AM, with 4 other people on a rotated schedule. That's no more than 3 a night and sometimes 2 a night. After a few months, I become friends with my co-workers. We'd take smoke breaks and eat lunch in the back room playing music, etc. Honestly, it was a really chill job. I actually really enjoyed it. Working at night can mess up your brain, I realised that. However, my body completely adapted and I always felt energetic and ready to go to every shift. At this point, I should probably say that when we worked, all the doors were locked and there's absolutely no way to get in or out without triggering the nightly alarm. So on one particular night, we showed up just before the manager left for the night and locked up. He then told us that it would only be my co-worker, who I'll call Mike, and I, as our schedule. Jake, as I'll call him, called in sick about an hour ago. Me and Mike had no problem. I was probably closest to him because he was my age and he had my dad as a teacher at his school. We start our usual routine with walking around the store with my manager to ensure nobody else is there. We have to then go and check every single door and watch him alarm the doors on his way out. We decided the first order of business was to smoke a cigarette in the back of the warehouse. We never had a problem with accidentally setting it off because it was so high up. Here's where things get wild. Now stay with me. Me and Mike pulled a pallet stacked with boxes out from the warehouse and onto the main floor. I grabbed a dolly with some boxes of dried goods and headed to a different aisle so we could be ahead of schedule. We always typically split up for efficiency. About 15 minutes pass and I head back to take more boxes. The pallet was in a central point in between us. Neither of us were in the same aisle as it was. When I got there, I saw a bag of chips and dip opened up on the pallet with obvious dip marks. We would often eat from this and just leave cash at the front of the cashier so that way they could go and sort this out in the morning. Our manager was fine with it. Mike met me at the pallet and I was loading up on my second trip. I then started making fun of Mike for grabbing them because it just seemed like a really weird thing to grab. He then looked into my eyes with this deadly serious look. His face had now changed. No, that's yours. Apparently my face did the same when I told him that it wasn't mine either. Obviously Jake was pulling a prank on us or something and the manager went along with it, right? No. At this point we both decided to be logical and check the store to catch whoever was doing this. We both have goosebumps the size of mosquito bites on our arm and we just try and laugh it off. But obviously something was wrong. Way wrong. It just seemed a little colder and we both were on edge. We sweep the warehouse and the back and the break room, etc. No dice. We're now getting closer to the front of the store. There's only one entrance to the store. It's right near all the 12 registers we had. Now in the front, there's this big metal rack. That's where we sold the charcoal for the grills and also those big logs that burn really slowly. As we walk inside of it, we hear a loud sound and 3 logs suddenly fly off the shelf. I'm not gonna lie, I screamed and it made Mike jump. We're freaking out at this point, but I stopped and convinced him to walk to the shelf with me so that way we could check it out. With 2 adults, each over 170 pounds, we realised that we couldn't even budget. Someone, or something, obviously threw it off with great force in front of our faces. We walk around the store again trying to figure out who or what was causing this, any excuse to blame this on, and we find nothing. We then decide the best thing to do is continue work and listen to loud music. We work together for the rest of the night. Here's the craziest part. We get in done a little early, so at 4:50, about 10 minutes earlier than we should have, and we started goofing off on those electric scooters for the handicapped people that are in front. It's critical I tell you this next part. The front had big glass windows, so that way you can see both in and out from the parking lot. We kinda just didn't talk about what we saw after it happened. I went to sleep that day and woke up to a call from Jake. He was practically having a panic attack. His mum, who worked there during the day, was one of the ones who come in at 5. She was older. Jake told me that just as we clocked out, he started talking to her and she said, "Who was that by the door?" It kind of looked like a person, but it was more like a black mist, just in front of you guys on the scooter. Needless to say, I couldn't sleep. Mike and I never worked alone after that. I later found out that Mike had a whole history of experiences like this running through his entire family. Hello everyone, I hope you all enjoyed that compilation. Those were some of my favourite stories that I've narrated recently, as well as featuring some of my favourite narrators that I've had on the channel. I'm currently working on 2 special subscriber count videos that are really good, and I've got some massive narrators on here, so I'm really excited to have that. These will be coming out over the next week and following. To celebrate my sub count, I'm also going to be releasing my merchandise on the same day as one of those videos, so make sure you keep an eye out for that. Also, as an update about myself, I'm scheduled to finally have a blood test to figure out why I get ill so often. I think it's because my immune system's probably really weak, but I'm gonna find out. I'm also going to be doing a Q&A video soon, so if you have any questions for me that you'd like to see in that, make sure you post it when I release a video. So I'm about to go out and watch the new It movie. If any of you have watched it, let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. So as always, I hope you all have a great day and take care.